The slab pressed down on his chest so hard that his ribs cracked one by one. Tae Gon lay in the darkness beneath tons of stone, listening to the dragon die. Nixarat was gasping for breath 3 meters away from him. Golden blood flowed through the cracks in the floor and trickled down to Tae Gon's face in warm streams. Any other person at that moment would have been praying or screaming. Tae Gon stared at the dragon's neck and thought of something entirely different. Thin slits were visible beneath the scales on its throat. Gills. Real gills on a creature that had spent its entire life flying. Its respiratory system had adapted. The dragon was preparing to become amphibious. 2 more molting cycles and Nixaroth would have gone into the ocean. Beautiful. Insanely beautiful. Tae Gon lay with broken ribs in a pool of someone else's blood, marveling at what this monster hadn't yet become. 10 years of working as a janitor in the guild's laboratory had taught him one thing: to look, to see what others didn't notice. The raiders saw numbers in Nixaroth, a level, a health bar, a threat. Tae Gon saw an evolution cut short. The dragon twitched one last time. The golden blood stopped flowing. Eyes the size of fists went dark. And at that moment, a window he hadn't seen in 10 years flashed before Tae Gon's eyes. System interface. Blue letters on a black background. A completed but unimplemented evolutionary branch detected. Host compatible. Claim. Tae Gon read it twice. Then he laughed. The rasp was wet and ragged because a broken rib was pressing against his lung. Compatible. After 10 years, he had suddenly become compatible. Thanks for the heads up. He pressed yes. The pain came immediately. Not human pain, but something deeper. As if every cell in his body had opened like a flower and let a foreign code in. Dragon gills didn't grow on his neck. They settled inside. They wove themselves into his lung tissue. They widened his bronchi. They restructured his capillaries. Tae Gon felt every stage of this restructuring because his body was an empty vessel. For 10 years, the system had kept him at level 1, with a ceiling of 1, and marked him as a host incompatibility. For 10 years, he was a nobody. A janitor at the Taeyang Guild's laboratory. A man who butchered monster carcasses for minimum wage. He wrote his dissertation into a desk drawer. He ate rice with kimchi 3 times a day because he couldn't afford anything more. And now, the system was telling him that he was compatible. That his emptiness was not a defect, but a function. That his body had been waiting for exactly this. The pain subsided after 3 minutes. Tae Gon lay beneath the stove and breathed. He breathed differently, deeper. The air entered his lungs like water into a sponge. Each breath filled him to the brim. The interface flashed again. Evolution accepted. Thermogill adaptation. Stage unstable. Stabilization required within 72 hours. Tae Gon closed the window and began to crawl out. The slab weighed a ton. An ordinary level 1 human wouldn't have been able to budge it even a millimeter. But Tae Gon had spent 10 years hauling monster carcasses through lab corridors. An S-rank lizard's carcass weighs 400 kilograms. He hauled them every day. His muscles weren't the muscles of an awakened one. They were the muscles of a porter who hadn't missed a shift in 10 years. He braced his back against the stone and pushed. He pushed until his vision darkened. He pushed until blood gushed from his nose. The slab shifted half a meter. It was enough to squeeze through sideways. Tae Gon crawled out from under the rubble into the dungeon corridor and got down on all fours. The area was empty. The raiders had been evacuated hours ago. No one had come back for the janitor. He looked at his reflection in a pool of golden blood. His face was black with dust. His eyes were red. His lips were split. But his pupils had changed. They had become vertical. For a split second. Then they returned to their normal shape. Tae Gon remembered this. He stood up. He headed for the exit. It was getting light on the surface. The entrance to the underground complex beneath Incheon looked like a construction site. Yellow tape, guild vans, empty coffee cups on the hoods. The raiders were gone. The medics were gone. The analysts were gone. Only 2 security guards remained at the gate, playing on their phones. Tae Gon stepped out of the portal, and one of the guards looked up. He glanced at Tae Gon. He glanced at his badge. 0. Janitor. He went back to his phone. Tae Gon walked past. No one asked where he'd been. No one asked if he was hurt. No one even noticed him. He got on the bus and headed to Seoul. It was quiet on the bus. The morning passengers were dozing. Tae Gon sat by the window, his hand pressed against his ribs. 2 were definitely broken. Maybe 3. He couldn't go to the hospital. A CT scan would show changes in his lung tissue, and then the questions would start. He rode to Mapo. He went into a pharmacy. He bought bandages and painkillers. He bandaged himself up in the restroom at the bus station. Then he went to work. The Taeyang Guild's laboratory was located in the basement of a corporate complex in Gangnam. Clean walls, white light, the smell of formaldehyde and disinfectant. Tae Gon changed into his work overalls and clocked in for his shift. The timekeeper glanced at her watch. He was 40 minutes late. She logged the penalty. Tae nodded and headed to the processing room. On the table lay the carcass of a B-rank stone scorpion. Standard procedure. Remove the carapace. Extract the core. Separate the mandibles for the weapons department. Place the entrails in a container for the alchemists. He picked up a knife and began to cut. His hands moved through the familiar motions. His mind was elsewhere. 72 hours. That was time he had to stabilize the dragon's evolution. Without stabilization, the body would begin to reject the foreign code. Heat, blood streaming from the eyes, chaotic degradation, irreversible distortion. He needed an alchemical substrate, a specific one that would bind the dragon's tissue to human tissue at the cellular level. He knew the formula. For 10 years, while dissecting carcasses, he had read every report that passed through the lab. He knew which substrates were used to stabilize the nuclei. He knew which reagents were needed. He knew the proportions. But he didn't know how to concoct them. That required an alchemist. Tae Gon cut open a scorpion and reminisced. In the alchemy department on the 3rd floor, there was a young woman he saw every Tuesday. She would come down to pick up tissue samples. Always at the same time. Always alone. Quiet. Precise in her movements. She'd pick up the containers without looking at the janitor. Im So-yeon. He knew her name because he signed the handover log. He knew she was an A-rank alchemist. He knew she was the youngest heiress of the Andong herbalist dynasty. And he knew one thing that no one else in the lab knew. Her substrates were the best in Seoul. Not because she was more talented than the others, but because she brewed them according to her brother's old notes. Tae Gon had seen those notes once. She'd left the notebook on the table in the cutting room when she was picking up samples. He didn't touch the notebook. But he scanned the open page in 3 seconds. The handwriting wasn't hers. It was a man's. Sweeping strokes, marginal notes, formulas with corrections, the living handwriting of a living person. Tae Gon asked the payroll clerk about it then. She said that So-yeon had an older brother, an alchemist too, rank B, support staff. 3 years ago, Taeyang stopped giving him orders. 2 months later, he took his own life. Tae Gon remembered this and never mentioned it in her presence. But now he needed an alchemist. And not just any alchemist, but one who knew how to work with non-standard substrates. Someone who wouldn't run off to report it to the guild. He finished butchering the scorpion by lunchtime. He packed everything into containers. He washed the table. He washed the floor. He washed the knives. He took off his coveralls. He sat down in the staff break room and ate rice with kimchi from a plastic container. His ribs ached. The painkiller from the pharmacy wasn't doing much good. He could feel something stirring inside him. It didn't hurt. It just felt strange, as if his lungs were getting used to a new geometry. He closed his eyes and saw, not with his eyes, but with something else. A diagram unfolded before his inner vision. A tree. The evolutionary tree of the stone scorpion he had just dissected. The branches spread out like the roots of an uprooted oak. One branch glowed a dull gold, unrealized. The scorpion could have developed vibrational sensors at the tips of its claws. It could have sensed movement through the stone. It didn't make it in time. Tae Gon opened his eyes. His hands were trembling. The autopsy section. His ability. It was working. He saw the monster's evolutionary trees. He saw which branches had been realized, which remained potential, which mutations had gotten stuck halfway. An ordinary hunter looked at a monster and saw a health bar and a threat level. Tae Gon looked and saw the species' history. The history of every decision evolution had made over thousands of generations. He stood up from the table. The rice had gone cold. His ribs ached. The clock showed 64 hours until the stabilization deadline. He needed So-yeon. Today was Tuesday. She would come for the samples at 4. So-yeon arrived at 4:03. As always, alone. A white lab coat, her hair pulled back, slender hands in gloves. She handed him the transfer log and Tae Gon signed it. Then he did something he hadn't done once in the 3 years they'd been working together. He spoke up. He said he needed advice on a non-standard substrate. So-yeon looked at him the way one looks at a piece of furniture that had suddenly started talking. A janitor asking for advice from Aerang, the alchemist. She could have refused. She could have just walked away. But Tae Gon added one sentence. He said the substrate was needed to stabilize dragon tissue within a human host. So-yeon froze. Her gloves creaked. She looked him in the eyes for the first time in 3 years. She asked what he meant. Tae Gon replied that he would explain, but not here. So-yeon was silent for 7 seconds. He counted them. Then she gave the address of a cafe 2 blocks away and the time, 8 p.m. She left with the containers. Tae Gon went back to cleaning. 61 hours until the deadline. The cafe was small. Plastic tables, fluorescent lights, coffee from a vending machine. Tae Gon arrived first and sat in the corner. So-yeon arrived 10 minutes later, without her lab coat. In her regular clothes, she looked younger, thinner. She sat across from him. She didn't order anything. She looked at him and waited. Tae Gon began to speak. He told her about the underground complex beneath Incheon, about Nixaroth, about the slab, about the golden blood, about the gills beneath the scales, about the system window, about the evolution he had embraced. He spoke evenly, without emotion, as if defending a dissertation. So-yeon listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question. She asked if he could prove it. Tae Gon closed his eyes. He opened them a second later. He looked at her and said he could see her evolutionary tree, not that of a monster, but hers, that of an awakened human. She was an A-rank alchemist with a growth ceiling of A+. Her main branch is the synthesis of organic substrates, but there is a second branch, unmanifested, subtle. She could synthesize substrates not from ryettes, but from her own blood, direct biosynthesis, an extremely rare mutation. So-yeon turned pale. She asked how he knew about the second branch. Tae Gon said he could see it, that it was his ability. So-yeon was silent for a long time. Then she asked about stabilization, how much time was left. Tae Gon said 59 hours. So-yeon stood up. She said she needed the components in 3 hours. She asked for his address. Tae Gon gave it to her. She left. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't smile. She just left to get to work. Tae Gon returned to his room in Mafo. The room was small. A bed, a desk, a bookshelf crammed with textbooks on evolutionary biology, a folder containing a dissertation that would never be accepted. On the wall, a hand-drawn chart of ceratopsian phylogenetic trees. He lay down on the bed and felt a wave of heat, the first sign of rejection. Too soon. It wasn't supposed to start this fast. Apparently, the dragon's evolution was too powerful for his body. He closed his eyes and saw his own evolutionary tree. Empty. Completely empty. A single branch. Observer. Level 1. Ceiling 1. And now, a sprout hung from that empty branch. Golden. Alien. Dragon-like. It pulsed and drew resources from his body. Without stabilization, the sprout would devour him from the inside. Tae Gon lay there and waited. There was a knock at the door at 11 o'clock at night. So-yeon stood in the doorway with a metal case. She walked in without asking. She opened the case on the table. Inside were 3 vials of dark green liquid. It smelled of pine needles and something bitter. She said the substrate was experimental, that she'd modified the formula based on her brother's notes, that there were no guarantees. Tae Gon sat down on the bed. He took off his shirt. So-yeon saw his torso and fell silent. Thin lines were visible beneath the skin along his ribs, golden, like capillaries, traces of the dragon tissue that was growing into his body. Se-yeon put on gloves. She took the first ampule. She injected the substrate into a vein at the crook of his elbow. Heat washed over him like a wave. Tae Gon clenched his teeth. The second ampule. The third. The golden lines on his ribs darkened. Then they faded. Then they vanished. They retreated inward. Stabilization. So-yeon checked his pulse. 120, then 110, then 90. She nodded. She said the process was complete. Tae Gon exhaled, and that exhale felt different. The week following stabilization passed quietly. Tae Gon went to work. He cut up carcasses. He mopped the floors. He returned home. He lay on the bed and listened. His hearing hadn't changed. The dragon's evolution had given him lungs, not ears. But he felt a difference in his body. His breathing had become deeper. His stamina had increased. He could haul containers down the lab corridors non-stop for 4 hours straight. Before, he'd take a break every hour. No one noticed. A janitor hauls heavy loads. Who cares how many times he stops? Tae Gon was used to being invisible. 10 years of invisibility teach you one thing: patience. But now that patience had a purpose. He knew the method worked. He knew he could absorb others' evolutions. He knew that So-yeon was capable of brewing a stabilizer. All that remained was to find the next source. A monster of at least A rank with an unrealized evolutionary branch. And he had to be present at its death. The problem was simple. Tae Gon worked in the lab, not in the field. A cleaner doesn't go on raids. A cleaner gets what the raiders bring back. Corpses, cores, chunks, but sometimes the guild would auction off what it didn't need: damaged bodies, cracked cores, defective carcasses. Tae Gon knew the schedule for these auctions because he was the one who carried the catalog cards into the auction hall every Thursday at 10 in the morning, the basement of the Taeyang Commercial Center in Yonsan. He'd been reviewing the catalogs even before they were printed because he typed up the text from the handwritten requests of the butchering department. He knew which carcasses were going up for sale. He knew the condition of every core. He knew what the guild appraisers were overlooking. And then, in the catalog for the following Thursday, he saw a line that made him stop. Bone Wolf, B rank, core damaged, minimum price. Tae Gon knew this species. Bone wolves embedded C and B rank dungeons throughout Korea. Ordinary monsters, nothing special by the guild's standards. But Tae Gon had read about them in a monograph by Professor Jeon In-ho of Seoul National University, the only monograph on the morphogenesis of subterranean predators written before all biologists became guild consultants. The bone wolf was at an interesting evolutionary crossroads. Its auditory system was overdeveloped for its current stage of evolution. There were too many nerve endings in its skull. The structure of the inner ear was too complex. Professor Chong hypothesized that the species was preparing to transition to echolocation, ultrasonic navigation in complete darkness. One molt, maybe two, and the wolf would begin to see the world through sound. Guild raiders killed bone wolves by the dozens. The cores were extracted using the standard method, B or at the base of the skull. Quick, rough, effective. And each time they destroyed the undeveloped gland located behind the occipital bone, because they didn't know it was there. Because not a single raider in the world had read Professor Jeon In-ho's monograph. But Tae Gon had. The auction took place on Thursday. Tae Gon arrived half an hour early. The hall was half empty. The auction of leftover materials didn't attract serious buyers. A few artifact dealers, a couple of novice alchemists, 100 a guy who bought up bones for fertilizer. Tae Gon sat in the back row and waited. When the lot with the bone wolf was brought out onto the podium, no one raised their hand except the old fertilizer dealer. Tae Gon raised his hand. The old man raised his again. Tae Gon raised his again. The old man looked at him. He saw the lab technician's work overalls. He saw the janitor's badge. He snorted and stepped back. Why argue with a nobody over a defective carcass? Tae Gon paid 2 weeks' wages, his entire savings, which he'd been putting aside for half a year. The auctioneer processed the paperwork and asked where to deliver it. Tae Gon said he'd pick it up himself. The auctioneer looked at him in surprise. The bone wolf's carcass weighed 100 million kilograms. Tae Gon hoisted it onto his shoulder and carried it toward the exit. 10 years of work as a loader, 180 kilograms, heavy but doable. He didn't make it to the exit. Halfway there, a voice stopped him. A young man in a Taeyang analyst's uniform was standing by a pillar, filming with his phone. Next to him were 2 others in the same uniform jackets. The analyst said something to his colleague, and they both laughed. Tae Gon caught snippets of the conversation. Zero bought a defective carcass. The janitor's playing hunter. Probably wants to hang the head on the wall. Tae Gon walked past. He didn't stop. He didn't look. 10 years of invisibility teach you that too, not to react. But he remembered the analyst's face. Not out of revenge, out of habit. The janitor notices everything because no one looks at him. Tae Gon didn't take the carcass home. He rented a table at a small-scale processor's cutting room in Mafo, an old neighborhood, narrow streets, basement-style workshops. The shop owner was an elderly man who, back when used to fillet fish but switched to monsters after the rift, he didn't ask any questions. Tae Gon placed the wolf carcass on the table. He took out a pocket knife, not a professional butcher's knife, but an ordinary folding knife he'd carried since he was 14. It was with this knife that he dissected his first frog in biology class. With this knife, he'd spent 10 years dissecting monsters in the lab when the government-issued knives were in use. The blade was thin from being sharpened so often, perfect for delicate work. He closed his eyes. The dissection mode activated. The evolutionary tree of the bone wolf unfolded before his inner eye. More complex than that of a scorpion, more branches, more potential. And there it was, the golden branch, unrealized. Echolocation, a gland behind the occipital bone, small, the size of a grape, full of nerve connections that had never been activated. Tae Gon opened his eyes and began to cut. Not the way a guild butcher would cut. They worked quickly and roughly. They needed the core, and that was all. Tae Gon worked like a surgeon, every incision precise, every movement deliberate. He peeled the skin back from the skull, exposed the bone, found the seam between the occipital and parietal plates. He inserted the blade. He pried it open. Beneath the bone lay a gland, small, pink, pulsing with a faint glow, alive. The wolf's core had been damaged, but the gland remained intact. The guild raiders didn't know it existed because their scanners were tuned to cores, not to glands, not to undeveloped organs, not for a future that never happened. Tae Gon spoke aloud, quietly, to himself. This species was supposed to develop echolocation after one molt. They damaged the core because they stabbed here, but they should have stabbed here. He pointed his finger, first at the standard extraction point, then at the correct one. A difference of 3 centimeters. 3 centimeters between what everyone knew and what only he knew. Tae Gon placed his hand on the gland. He closed his eyes. The inheritance ritual. He didn't know how it worked technically. The system didn't provide instructions, but in the cave near Incheon with Nixirat, he'd simply said yes, and his body had done the rest. Now he did the same thing, except yes. The air above the table quivered. For a second, maybe 2. A silhouette appeared above the dead wolf's carcass. Not a dead wolf, but what it could have become. With long ears spread out like radar dishes, with an elongated muzzle, with a graceful, almost deer-like body. Beautiful, perfect, unfinished. The silhouette flickered and entered Tae Gon. The pain was shorter than with the dragon, sharp, concentrated in his head, his temples, the back of his head, his inner ear, his eardrums. Everything shifted within a minute. Tae Gon opened his eyes and the world had changed. Sound. He could hear everything, not louder but more clearly. The workshop manager's footsteps in the adjacent hall. His heart rate, 62 beats per minute. A drop of water from the faucet in the corner. A distance of 4.7 meters. And voices behind the wall. In the neighboring auction hall, whispers, 2 people. One was speaking to the other. Did you see that zero-sum fool who bought a dead wolf? What's he going to do with it? The second replied, maybe eat it. That's all he's got left. Both laughed. Tae Gon smiled. For the first time in 10 years. Not out of politeness, not out of habit, genuinely. That fool bought his future from you at the price of the past. The interface flashed. Evolution accepted. Ultrasonic sensors. Stage unstable. Stabilization required within 72 hours. Tae Gon put away the carcass. He wiped down the table. He paid the owner the rent. He stepped outside. He took out his phone. He dialed So-yeon's number. She answered on the first ring. He said he needed a substrate, a different one, for nerve tissue. So-yeon was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said she'd have it for him that evening. Tae Gon put away his phone and walked home. The world sounded different, fuller. Every step a passerby took, every car engine, every breath a child took in the stroller across the street, 6 times sharper than usual. He heard the city as he'd never heard it before, and the city didn't know it was being listened to. So-yeon arrived at 8. With the same briefcase, but her expression was different, not professionally neutral, but tense. She walked in and the first thing she asked was how often he planned to do this. Tae Gon replied that he'd do it as often as necessary. So-yeon set the case on the table. She opened it. 4 vials this time, light blue, a different composition. She said she'd modified the formula for nerve tissue. She'd added blue ginseng root extract from the family's reserves, an expensive ingredient. Tae Gon asked how much he owed her. So-yeon didn't answer the question. Instead, she asked him to demonstrate. Tae Gon understood. He closed his eyes. He opened them. He looked at her and began to describe it. Her evolutionary tree, in detail, branch by branch. The main branch of alchemical synthesis, the side branch of diagnostics, the dormant branch of biosynthesis from blood, and one more, a thin one, almost invisible. Empathic resonance with organic substrates. The ability to sense the state of a potion as if it were her own body. So-yeon listened without moving. When he finished, she asked if he had seen anything like this in her brother. Tae Gon said he couldn't see the trees of the dead, only the living or those who had just died. So-yeon nodded. Something in her eyes had changed. They hadn't warmed up, but they were slightly less closed off. She injected the substrate, 4 vials. Stabilization occurred more quickly, 20 minutes. Tae Gon was getting used to it. The body was getting used to it. The echolocation had integrated into the hearing aid. The golden thread lay next to the dragon's gills. 2 alien futures in a single human body. So-yeon packed up her case. She stopped at the door. She said she wanted to keep records. Every stabilization, every reaction, every change. Tae Gon agreed. So-yeon left. This time, she looked back. Just once, quickly. For the next 3 days, Tae Gon tested his new abilities. Carefully. At work. The lab was the perfect environment. Dozens of monster carcasses every day. He could practice the autopsy section without drawing attention. He'd simply look at the carcass, close his eyes for a second, see a tree. He memorized them. He wrote them down in his notebook that evening. Over the course of 3 days, he examined 26 carcasses of different species. 14 of them had unrealized branches. In 9 of them, the branches were trivial, slightly sharper claws, thicker hide. Minor adaptations not worth the risk. But in 5 of them, he saw something interesting. The B-rank cave crab had an unfinished limb regeneration branch. The C-rank dark mantis had the beginnings of an optical camouflage system. The A-rank swamp boa had unique thermoreception that allowed it to see heat maps from a kilometer away. Tae Gon wrote everything down. He was compiling a catalog, like a scientist, like a collector, like a man who had been observing for 10 years and could finally record what he saw. The decision to leave Taeyong didn't come suddenly. Tae Gon had been thinking about it for 3 weeks. Ever since the second evolution had stabilized, he'd realized that continuing to work in the lab was dangerous. Not because he might be exposed. The scanners still showed 0. Observer. Level 1. Ceiling 1. The silent carrier was working perfectly. The danger lay elsewhere. Every day in the lab, he saw the evolutionary trees of dozens of carcasses and could do nothing about them. Unrealized branches faded away as they decomposed. A future that would never happen. He watched as raiders broke the cores in the wrong places, as alchemists threw away undeveloped glands along with the waste. How entire evolutionary lines went extinct on the cutting tables simply because no one knew they existed. It was like watching a library being burned, one book at a time. He couldn't stand it any longer. He wrote a letter of resignation. He placed it on the shift supervisor's desk. The supervisor looked at the paper. He looked at Tae Gon. He asked where he was headed. Tae Gon replied that he was starting his own business. The supervisor snorted. He asked what kind. Tae Gon said he would be butchering and disposing of monster carcasses. The supervisor laughed, not maliciously, but sincerely. He said, "So Zero is opening a butcher shop. Good joke." He signed the application. Tae Gon packed up his locker, his coveralls, a pocket knife, a notepad with his notes, and a notebook containing a catalog of the evolutionary trees of 26 species. He walked out of the basement of the corporate complex in Gangnam. As he emerged onto the surface, the sun blinded him. He squinted. 10 years in the basement, he'd forgotten just how bright the light could be. He found a workshop in Mafo, an old neighborhood on the banks of the Hangang. Narrow streets, 2-story houses, small shops. A neighborhood where those overlooked by the system lived. Ordinary people without ranks, small-scale artisans, retirees, day laborers. The rent here was 10 times lower than in Kanam. Tae Gon found a space on the ground floor of an old building, a former fish shop. It smelled of the sea and old wood. He hung up a sign. Carcass cutting and disposal. Inexpensive. He wrote the letters by hand with a black marker on a piece of plywood. So-yeon came to take a look that same evening. She stood at the entrance and silently surveyed the space. A concrete floor, a steel table, a sink, 2 knives. One was old and the other a new cutting knife bought at the market for next to nothing. So-yeon said there was no ventilation here. Tae Gon replied that he would open the window. So-yeon looked at the window. It faced the wall of the neighboring house, just half a meter away. She didn't say anything. She took a small fan out of her bag. She placed it on the windowsill. She turned it on. She left. The first customers arrived 2 days later. Not hunters, just ordinary people from the neighborhood. An old man who had found a dead parasitic beetle in the basement of his house and wanted someone to get rid of it. A woman who had bought a monster's tooth on the black market to use as an amulet and wanted to verify its authenticity. A young boy who had dragged in the skeleton of a rat monster he'd found at a landfill and wanted to know what species it was. Tae Gon worked with each of them, seriously, carefully. He disposed of the beetle for free. He examined the tooth and said it was genuine. An S-rank stone fang, the 3rd molar on the right side. The woman was satisfied. He explained to the boy that the skeleton belonged to an E-rank sewer rat, the lowest class, not dangerous to anyone. But he showed him the structure of the skull. He explained why the rat had such incisors. He told him that in 3 generations, this species could develop the ability to gnaw through stone. The boy listened with his mouth agape. He left and returned the next day with 2 friends. Tae Gon showed them all the same thing. The neighborhood began to recognize him. The butcher from House 7, a quiet guy. He knows more about monsters than TV does. Baek Jia showed up in the 3rd week. Tae Gon was sitting in the workshop one evening, rereading his notes, when the door opened without a knock. The girl walked in quickly, thin, short hair, a jacket borrowed from someone else, a vape in her mouth, a tablet in her hand. She scanned the workshop in 2 seconds. She looked at Tae Gon. She asked if he was the one who butchered the carcasses. Tae Gon nodded. She sat down at the dissection table without asking. She placed the tablet in front of him. A map was displayed on the screen. The coordinates of a dungeon in a forested area north of Seoul, classified as E rank, officially cleared 2 years ago. She said it hadn't been cleared, that there was still something alive in there, and she wanted to sell it. Tae Gon looked at the map. He looked at her. He asked where she got the information. Jia smirked. She said that information was her job. She was a scout. She found what others didn't notice. Hidden lairs, forgotten fissures, dungeons that the guilds had written off but the monsters hadn't. Tae Gon asked what her rank was. Jia took a long drag on her vape and exhaled to the side. She said she had none. She hadn't gone through initiation. She'd grown up in the orphanage system. She'd simply been forgotten. No level, no class, no entry in the interface. To the system, she didn't exist. Tae Gon froze. He looked at her differently. He closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them. The autopsy section. He tried to see her evolutionary tree, and saw nothing. Emptiness. Not like his. Not blocked, but absent. The system didn't see her at all. To the system, Jia wasn't a zero. She was non-existent. Tae Gon told her this. He said that the system doesn't see him because his class is hidden. But it doesn't see her because she's completely outside the system. Jia froze. A sigh P hung on her lips. She asked what that meant. Tae Gon replied that it meant no scanner in the world would detect her presence. No guild tracker would pick her up. No security system would go off. She was invisible. Not like a spy in disguise. Like a person who doesn't exist in the world's database. Jia was silent. Then she said that her whole life she'd considered the absence of a class to be a defect. That because of it, she couldn't get insurance. She couldn't legally rent an apartment. She couldn't get a normal job. Tae Gon replied quietly. He said she wasn't defective. He said the system couldn't see her and that she needed to understand how valuable that was. Jia looked at him for a long time. Then she jumped down from the table. She said the hideout was worth 500,000 won. Tae Gon said he didn't have that kind of money. Jia thought for a moment. She said that in that case, she'd go with him and take her share of the loot. Tae Gon agreed. They set out the next morning. Jia knew the route. A commuter train to Uijeongbu, then a bus, then a 3-kilometer walk through the forest park. The entrance to the underground was hidden behind a waterfall, a small crack in the rock, camouflaged by moss. Jia found it by the sound. Inside, the air hummed at a low frequency. Tae Gon could hear that hum from 100 meters away thanks to his wolf's echolocation. He told Jia. She looked at him with interest. She asked where he'd gotten such keen hearing. Tae Gon replied that he had worked in silence for many years. Jia didn't believe him but didn't argue. They entered the crevice. The corridor sloped downward at a 30-degree angle. The walls were damp. The ceiling was low. After 200 meters, the corridor widened into a cave, and Tae Gon saw it. A low-rank demon. A rank according to the classification. The creature sat in the center of the cave, motionless. It was massive, 3 meters tall and armored. Bone plates covered its body from neck to toes. Its head was small. Its eyes were closed. It was alive, but barely. Tae Gon could tell by the pulsation of its core. Weak. Fading. The demon was dying. Tae Gon closed his eyes. The autopsy section. The demon's evolutionary tree unfolded before him. Powerful. Ancient. Dozens of branches, realized and unrealized. The bone armor was its current form. But further up the tree lay a golden branch, unmanifested. The demon was preparing to transition to the next stage. The bone plates were meant to become movable, not rigid armor, but adaptive armor that reconfigures itself based on the type of the threat. A sword strike, the plates contract. A magical attack, the plates disperse. Universal protection. The demon did not live to reach this stage. He was wounded 2 years ago when the guild was clearing out the dungeon. He went into hiding. It lay in wait, and slowly faded away. Tae Gon opened his eyes and sensed it. The inheritance ritual had a condition. The monster must have an emotional attachment to its next stage. Tae Gon had to feel that the creature wanted to live, wanted to become what it could have become, and he felt it. The demon didn't want to die. Its core pulsed faintly but stubbornly. It had held on for 2 years in an empty cave, without food or light. It was waiting, waiting for something. Tae Gon moved closer. Jia grabbed his sleeve. She hissed that he was crazy. It's an A-rank demon. Even as it dies, it can kill a 0 rank with a single move. Tae Gon gently pried her fingers loose. He said the demon wouldn't attack. It was too weak. He stepped 3 meters closer. He crouched down. The demon opened one eye. Cloudy. Yellow. The pupil was vertical. It looked at the man in front of it. Tae Gon spoke aloud, quietly, respectfully. He said he could see its evolutionary tree, that he could see a branch the demon hadn't had time to realize, that he could see what kind of protection it could have become, that it was beautiful. The demon blinked. Its second eye opened. Both pupils focused on Tae Gon. Tae Gon reached out. He placed his hand on the bone plate on the demon's knee. Warm, alive, pulsing. He said that if the demon allowed it, he would take that branch. Not steal it, take it, preserve it, complete it. The demon stared at him for 30 seconds. Then it closed its eyes. The core flickered one last time and went out. The demon died, waiting, as if it had decided it was okay. Ji-Ah stood behind Tae Gon, holding her breath. The stabilization of the third evolution was more difficult than the previous ones. So Yan came to the workshop with an expanded kit, 6 vials instead of 4. The bone tissue substrate required a different base. She used powder made from the bones of an on-rank monster's bone powder mixed with mountain iris root extract. Her brother hadn't provided a formula for such a case. She improvised. Tae Gon could tell by the look of her hands. Her movements were slightly less confident than usual. The pause before each injection was half a second longer, but her hands didn't tremble. An A-rank alchemist from the Anybody and Andon's herbalists would never let her hands tremble. The first 3 vials went in smoothly. On the 4th, Tae Gon lost consciousness for 12 seconds. So-yeon didn't stop. She administered the 5th, the 6th. When he came to, the lines of the bone armor beneath his skin were already fading. The stabilization was working. So-yeon was sitting on a chair nearby, writing in a notebook. Not her brother's notebook, her own. A new one. Tae Gon noticed this and said nothing. Jia was in the workshop. She was sitting in the corner on a box, watching. When So-yeon finished, Jia stood up and walked over. She looked at Tae Gon. She looked at So-yeon. She asked point blank, "What kind of junk are you injecting him with? And why were the veins in his neck glowing gray?" So-yeon looked at her, then at Tae Gon. Tae Gon nodded. So-yeon explained briefly. A stabilization substrate, foreign tissue in a human host. Without the substrate, rejection. With the substrate, integration. Jia listened while chewing on something. Then she said that it all sounded like a very expensive way to die. Tae Gon smirked. So-yeon didn't smirk. She said that the risk was very real, that every new evolution increases the strain on the body, that she didn't know the limit. Tae Gon replied that the limit would be determined by biological compatibility, not the system, not numbers, his own biology. So-yeon looked at him and, for the first time, asked the question that had been hanging in the air since day one. She asked if he remembered what he was like before Nixaroth. Tae Gon didn't answer right away. Then he said that he was a janitor, that he had poor eyesight and sore knees from 10 years on a concrete floor, that he loved the bibimbap from the shop near Mafo Station, that he remembered. So-yeon nodded. She put away her notebook. She left. Jia watched her go. She turned to Tae Gon. She said that the alchemist was afraid of him. Tae Gon replied that he knew. Jia asked if he was afraid of himself. Tae Gon thought for a moment. He replied that not yet. Jia snorted and left as well. A month after the butcher shop opened, Tae Gon's workshop he was working. It was routine work, butchering carcasses for small-time customers. The neighborhood knew him by now. Low-ranking lone hunters brought in trophies they couldn't sell to the guilds. Tae Gon butchered them cleanly and cheaply. He kept for himself what the customers considered trash: damaged glands, shards of cores, undeveloped organs. What was waste to the raiders was a library to him. He scanned every sample. He updated his catalog. By the end of the month, his notebook contained 147 entries on the evolutionary trees of 32 species, 43 unrealized branches, 9 potentially suitable for inheritance. He took his time. He didn't grab everything haphazardly. The biologist in him demanded order. Each evolution had to be compatible with the previous ones. The dragon provided thermal gills. The wolf provided echolocation. The demon provided bone armor. 3 systems: respiratory, sensory, defensive. The next one had to be regenerative. The body's logic demanded it. Without regeneration, the 3 foreign systems would conflict under stress. He needed a crab. A-Rang giant crab, armored regenerator, a species inhabiting the coastal dungeons of the southern shore. Unremarkable to the guilds, low attack power, slow movement, a small and unprofitable core. But Tae Gon knew from his records that this species had a unique, untapped branch. Complete regeneration of limbs with the transfer of nerve endings. Not just regrowing a claw, but regeneration that preserves muscle memory. A crab that lost a claw would grow a new one that remembered all the movements of the old one. A biological miracle. No one knew about this. Tae Gon knew because he had found the beginnings of this system in the rank cave crab in the Taeyang laboratory. He extrapolated. He checked the monographs. A 90% match. In the A-rank version, this branch should be fully formed but not activated. The problem was that he needed a live A-rank giant crab, or at least a dead one, with its iron intact. The Taeyang auctions didn't sell anything like that. The coastal dungeons were controlled by the Baekho Guild, the third giant, the most secretive one. Tae Gon couldn't go there legally. A zero cleaner without a guild license had no right to enter dungeons above E-Rang. He needed Jia. He called her. She answered right away. He said he needed an A-Rang giant crab from the southern coast, alive or no more than 3 hours dead. Jia was silent for 5 seconds. Then she asked if he knew how much an illegal raid into Baekho territory would cost. Tae Gon said he knew. Jia said it wasn't a matter of money, it was a matter of life and death. Baekho kills intruders on the spot. Tae Gon replied that he wouldn't go into the dungeon himself. He needed Jia to find out when Baekho conducts sweeps of the coastal dungeons, where they send the loot, and whether there are any corrupt couriers among them. Jia thought for a moment. She said she needed a week. Tae Gon agreed. 5 days later, Jia came to the workshop at night. She brought a tablet and a box of rice cakes. She sat down at the cutting table. She opened the tablet and showed the schedule. Baekho raided the coastal dungeons once every 2 weeks and sent the loot to processing at her own complex in Busan. But there was a transporter, a truck driver, an ordinary man with no social standing. He worked as a subcontractor. He hauled second-rate material, the kind the guild considered waste. Jia contacted him. For 300,000 won, he was willing to hand over the contents of a single container of waste, without asking why. Tae Gon looked at her. He asked where the money was coming from. Jia said it was his problem, not hers. Tae Gon nodded. He didn't have 300,000. The workshop's monthly income was 400, minus rent, minus materials, minus 2 meals a day. That left 120. He thought for a moment. He pulled the folder with his dissertation from under the bed. 300 pages, 10 years of work. Morphogenesis of subterranean predators. Evolutionary models and adaptive strategies. A work that would never be accepted because the author was a nobody. Tae Gon placed the folder on the table. He looked at it. Then he put it back. No, not the dissertation. He took the collection out of the closet. 15 monster bone specimens, collected over 10 years, catalogued, numbered, each with a description of the species and stage of development. A biologist's collection, his only asset besides his knowledge. He called an artifact dealer from the auction house. The dealer arrived in the morning. He looked over the collection, offered 200,000. Tae Gon agreed. Topped it off with his earnings, made it 300. The container was delivered a week later, at night. The truck pulled up to the workshop at 2 o'clock. The driver unloaded a steel box the size of a refrigerator, took the money, drove away. Tae Gon opened the container. Inside were cleaning scraps, fragments of carapaces, shards of claws, scraps of chitin, and at the bottom, the entire carcass of an A-Rang giant crab. Small by the species standards, a young specimen, killed 12 hours ago. The core had been extracted using standard methods, roughly, through the abdominal cavity, but the head was intact. Tae Gon closed his eyes. The autopsy section. The tree had unfurled, young, promising, and there it was, the golden branch. Limb regeneration with nerve-ending transfer, unmanifested, intact. The gland at the base of the cephalic ganglion, undamaged. Tae Gon took the carcass out of the container, placed it on the table, took out a pocket knife, began to work. Cut open the cephalothoracic carapace, found the ganglion, found the gland. Tiny, the size of a pea, but alive, pulsing with a faint pink light. The gland still remembered that its host had wanted to live. The young crab was heading toward its first molt, toward its first renewal. It wanted to grow. Tae Gon placed his hand on the gland. He spoke softly. "I'm sorry, my friend. You would have grown into a beautiful creature. The Ritual of Inheritance. The silhouette of a crab rose above the carcass, not a dead one, but one of the future. With new claws, large and graceful, and thin nerve fibers running along the chitin like electrical wiring. The silhouette flickered. It entered Tae Gon. The pain was different this time. Not sharp, but a dull ache, as if every joint in his body had opened up and gained an extra degree of freedom. His muscles vibrated, his tendons tensed and relaxed. The crab's regenerative tissue spread evenly over his entire body, not in just one place, everywhere. Tae Gon clenched his teeth and waited it out. 3 minutes. 4. 5. The pain subsided. He raised his hand, clenched his fist, unclenched it. The sensation was strange. Each finger remembered more than before. His muscle memory had expanded. He hadn't become stronger, he had become more precise. The interface flashed as usual. The evolution had taken. Limb regeneration with nerve transfer. Stage unstable. 72 hours. Tae Gon called So-yeon, 4th substrate. She answered without words. She simply stated the time. Stabilization took 2 hours. So-yeon brought 8 vials, a substrate for neuromuscular tissue based on an extract from a deep-sea jellyfish species, a rare component. She said she'd used her own supplies from the lab for it. Tae Gon asked if she would get in trouble. So-yeon said she had already submitted her resignation from Taeyang. Tae Gon froze. He asked why. So-yeon replied with a short sentence. She said his work was more interesting. Then she corrected herself. She said his work was more important. Then she fell silent and injected the substrate. 8 vials. Tae Gon lost consciousness twice, for 1 second each time. So-yeon recorded everything in her notebook. The time, the dosage, the body's reaction, the duration of the loss of consciousness, the color of his veins, his skin temperature. She worked like a scientist, like an alchemist whose brother had died because of the system's indifference. The stabilization was complete. 4 evolutions in one body. Dragon, wolf, demon, crab. 4 alien futures that would never have happened without him. He didn't meet So-ga-in the way he'd planned. He'd planned to go up to the 2nd floor in the morning, knock, introduce himself, to ask if the noise from the workshop was bothering her, politely, quietly, like a neighbor. Instead, she came herself, at 3 in the morning. He woke up to a knock, not on the door, on the wall. 3 knocks, deafening, heavy, then silence, then 3 more. Tae Gon got up. The wolf's echolocation kicked in automatically. He could hear a heartbeat through the wall, fast, 140 beats per minute. Her breathing was ragged, and the smell, alcohol, strong. Through the wall and the closed window, he stepped out of the workshop onto the staircase. He went up to the 2nd floor. The door was ajar. The light was off. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. So-ga-in was sitting on the floor against the wall. Empty bottles lay scattered around her. 4, 5. Soju. She was staring at the wall in front of her and methodically pounding it with her fist. Not hard, not with rage, mechanically, like a metronome. Thud. Pause. Thud. Her knuckles were scraped raw and bleeding. Tae Gon stopped in the doorway. She noticed him. She turned her head. The scar on her chin glowed white in the darkness. Her eyes were cloudy. She asked who he was. Tae Gon replied that he was the neighbor from downstairs, a butcher. She stared at him for 10 seconds. Then she turned away. She pounded the wall again. Tae Gon didn't leave. He walked into the apartment. He found the kitchen. He found the kettle. He boiled water. He brewed tea from the only tea bag he found in the cupboard. He brought it to her, set it down on the floor next to her. She didn't look at the cup. He sat down against the opposite wall. He was silent. She was silent. 20 minutes later, she picked up the cup. She drank it. She rested her hand on her knee. She looked at her knuckles. The blood was already drying. She asked if he was afraid to be sitting in the apartment of a drunk woman he didn't know. Tae Gon replied that he wasn't. She asked why. He said that her pulse had already dropped to 100 and her breathing had evened out. She's not dangerous. Ga-eun looked at him with something resembling interest. She asked how he knew her pulse. Tae Gon replied that he could just see it. Ga-eun snorted. She closed her eyes. 3 minutes later, she fell asleep right up against the wall. Tae Gon stood up. He found a blanket. He covered her with it. He left. He closed the door. In the morning, she went down to the workshop. Without knocking, she walked in. Tae Gon was working. The carcass of a C-rank stone hedgehog lay on the table. An order from a lone hunter. Standard butchering. Ga-eun stood by the door and watched him work. Tae Gon could feel her gaze but didn't turn around. He cut. Precisely, carefully. He separated the armor plates from the soft tissue. He extracted the core. This time, he did it correctly. Not through the standard entry point, but through an alternative one, preserving the undeveloped glands. Ga-eun watched for 15 minutes. Then she said he didn't cut like a guild butcher. Tae Gon replied that he wasn't a guild butcher. Ga-eun said that she could see that. She said that guild butchers work quickly and sloppily, but he works like a surgeon. Tae Gon replied that every carcass deserves precision. Guyan was silent. Then she asked how much he charged for butchering. Tae Gon named his price, 3 times lower than the guild's. Guyan nodded. She said she had a trophy from her last raid a year and a half ago. She hadn't been able to sell it, and she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Tae Gon asked what kind of trophy it was. Guyan replied briefly, "My partner's core." Tae Gon froze. 5 minutes later, he was sitting at a table in the workshop while Guyan stood across from him. A small object lay on the table between them. Not a monster's core, a human core crystal. After an awakened one dies, their core crystallizes. Small, dull. It has no commercial value. The guilds dispose of them as bio-waste. But Gain had taken her partner's core. She'd carried it for a year and a half. Tae Gon stared at the crystal. He closed his eyes. The autopsy room. The evolutionary tree of an awakened human looked different from that of a monster. Thinner, more fragile. But the structure was the same. Branches, realized and unrealized. He saw the class of Gain's former partner. Warrior, V rank. Ceiling, A rank. Specialization, close combat. Realized branch, enhanced musculature. Secondary branch, increased pain tolerance. And the date of death woven into the fading pattern of the tree. A year and a half ago. A raid on a B-rank dungeon near Daegu. Tae Gon saw the circumstances through the residual traces in the crystal. Not clearly, blurred, like a photograph through a fogged-up window. A collapse. His partner could have escaped. The evacuation portal was 20 meters away, but between the portal and him was Gain, unconscious, pinched beneath the rubble. His partner didn't run toward the portal. He turned around, ran toward her, lifted the slab, pushed her into the portal. The portal closed. He stayed behind. Tae Gon opened his eyes. Gain was standing there, waiting. Her face was stony. She asked if he could read anything from the crystal. Tae Gon could have lied. He could have said he saw very little. He could have spared her. But he looked at her scraped knuckles and realized that to spare her would be an insult. She didn't want comfort. She wanted the truth. Tae Gon told her. He described his partner's evolutionary tree. Class, rank, specialization, branches that had been developed and those that hadn't, and the circumstances of his death, as he saw them. Blurred, but clear enough. His partner hadn't died in vain. He had chosen, consciously. He had turned back, ran toward her, lifted the slab. Tae Gon didn't add anything of his own. He didn't interpret. He simply described what he saw in the crystal's residual tree. Guyan listened without moving. When he finished, she stood there for another minute. Then she picked up the crystal from the table. She clenched it in her fist, turned around and walked out. She didn't say thank you. She didn't cry. She just left. Tae Gon heard her footsteps on the stairs. His echolocation picked up every one. She entered the apartment, closed the door. Silence. Then a sound. Not a thud against the wall. Something else. Quiet. Long. Tae Gon turned away. He didn't listen. There are things not meant for strangers' ears, even if those ears can hear through walls. 3 days later, Gon came down to the workshop again, sober, in clean clothes. Her hair was tied back. The scar on her chin was the same. Her eyes were different. Not cloudy, not empty, angry, alive. She said she wanted to know what he was really up to. Tae Gon looked at her. A former S-rank raider. Experienced, strong, dangerous. If she found out and told Tai Young, his workshop would be shut down that very day. But he remembered his partner's crystal. He remembered that Guyan had left the guild. He remembered that for a year and a half she'd lived alone, sawing and punching walls. He remembered that the system had told her partner that he was a B rank with an A ceiling. Not enough for evacuation priority. Not enough for anyone to come save him. Enough to die for the one he loved. Tae Gon made up his mind. He told her. Not everything, but enough. That he sees evolutionary trees. That he can absorb others' unrealized evolutions. That the system shows zero. That he's not a fighter. He's a dissector. A biologist. A person who looks at monsters and sees what they could become. Ga-in listened expressionlessly. When he finished, she asked one question. She asked why he had told her all this. Tae Gon answered. He said he needed someone who could cover for him in the field. He wasn't a fighter. While he was studying a monster's evolutionary tree, he needed time. Seconds. Minutes. In battle, that's an eternity. He needed someone who could give him that time. Gon was silent. Then she asked what she would get in return. Tae Gon thought for a moment. Then he said that the fourth evolution he'd acquired was regeneration with neural transfer from the giant crab. He didn't take it for himself. He took it because he knew there was a person living nearby who drank until she threw up every night and punched walls until she bled. Regeneration. It wasn't for him. It was for her. Every time she hurt herself, his body would restore that knowledge. Every time she needed help, he'd be there because his body literally remembered how to fix what was broken. Ga-in looked at him for a long time. Then she said it was the strangest reason she'd ever heard. Tae Gon replied that he was a biologist. Biologists have strange reasons. Ga-in didn't smile, but something in her expression shifted. It didn't warm up, it thawed. She said one word, "Let's go." Tae Gon asked where. She said to the roof, "You can see the neighborhood better from there. If he's going to work from this house, he needs to know the surroundings." Tae Gon stood up. He followed her. From the roof of the house in Mafo, a view of the old neighborhood opened up. Low-rise roofs, narrow streets. The Han River glistened in the distance. Even farther away were the glass towers of Gangnam. Two worlds, one with levels, the other without. Ga-in stood at the edge of the roof, smoking. Not a vape like Jia's, regular cigarettes. She pointed. To the left was the market. Every Thursday they sold goods from the underground there. A black market, no licenses. To the right was an old blacksmith's workshop. It had closed 2 years ago. The owner had left. Tae Gon asked who the owner was. Ga-in said she was a young woman, a blacksmith, from some old family, last name Cha. Ga-in didn't remember the details, but the workshop was still standing. The rent was paid up for 3 years in advance. Strange. Tae Gon made a mental note. Last name Cha, a blacksmith. He looked down. A boy was standing at the door of his workshop, the very same one who had brought the skeleton of the rat monster. 2 adults were with him, a man and a woman, his parents. They were waiting. Tae Gon went downstairs and opened the door. The boy's father bowed awkwardly. He said his son couldn't stop talking about monsters, that he used to be afraid of them but was now interested in them, and that his teacher at school had noticed. The mother took a container out of a bag, a kimchi taig, a homemade dish, as a token of gratitude. Tae Gon accepted it. He bowed in return. When they left, he placed the container on the table in his workshop and stared at it for a long time. That evening, So-yeon arrived with the test results. She had drawn his blood 2 days earlier and tested it in her home laboratory. The results were unusual. 4 foreign biological systems coexisted in his blood without conflict. But there was a nuance. So-yeon showed him the printout. There were graphs on the paper. The lines that were supposed to intersect ran parallel to one another. Dragon tissue, wolf tissue, demonic tissue, crab tissue. 4 layers, one on top of the other, without mixing, like pages in a book. So-yeon said this was impossible from a biochemical standpoint. Foreign tissues always conflict. The immune system attacks. Rejection sets in. Tae Gon showed no rejection at all. His body accepted everything. Just as a blank page accepts any text. Tae Gon nodded. An empty vessel. The system labeled him incompatible. In reality, he was compatible with everything. So-yeon closed the folder. She looked at him. She asked how much more he planned to take. Tae Gon replied, "As much as is needed." So-yeon asked, "Who needs it?" Tae Gon didn't answer. So-yeon left. She stopped at the doorway. She said that his substrate was for dragon tissue, the first one, the one she'd brewed using her brother's formula. It worked better than all the ones that followed, because it possessed a precision she herself hadn't yet been able to replicate. She said her brother was better than her, that the system had rated him as a B-rank support, and that this rating had killed him. Tae Gon replied quietly. He said that to him, her substrate was her brother's hands, which were still at work, that he was grateful to him. So-yeon stood with her back to him. She didn't move. Then she left. Quickly. Tae Gon heard her footsteps on the street. His echolocation picked up every one. 30 meters away, the footsteps stopped. For a moment. Then they resumed. He didn't listen any further. There are things not meant for strangers' ears. He found Cha Eun-ju not in the workshop, but at the cemetery. Ga-in gave him a tip. She said that the blacksmith from the old Cha family comes once a week to the cemetery in Mafo. Not to a grave. To the old plot where her grandfather's makeshift smithy had once stood. After the rift, the cemetery was expanded, and the smithy was torn down. Only the foundation remained, 4 stones in the ground. Yin-ju would come and sit on those stones. Tae Gon arrived on Saturday morning. She was sitting on the foundation with her back to the path, her back straight, her hands on her knees, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. A tool case stood on the ground nearby, long, heavy. Tae Gon approached. He stopped 3 meters away. He cleared his throat. She turned around. Her face was calm, stern. Her eyes were dark. She looked at him and asked who he was. Tae Gon introduced himself. He said he was a butcher from Mafo, that he'd heard about Blacksmith Cha's workshop, that he had some material she might want to see. Yinju didn't answer right away. She looked at him for 30 seconds, sizing him up. Then she asked what kind of material it was. Tae Gon took a cloth bundle out of his pocket and unwrapped it. Lying on the cloth were 3 fragments: a dragon scale, a shard of a demon's bone armor, and a plate of crab chitin. All 3 were fragments that had been shed, fragments of his own evolutionary stages. During stabilization, the body expelled excess material. So-yun had been collecting these fragments for analysis. Tae Gon took a portion of them. Yinju looked at the fragments. She didn't touch them, but her eyes changed. They widened for a split second. She recognized the material, not specifically these samples, but the type. Organic material from high-rank monsters. Unprocessed. Fresh. Such material was worth more on the black market than her entire workshop. She asked where it came from. Tae Gon said it was his own material. Yunju didn't understand. Tae Gon clarified. He said that his body rejects excess material when integrating foreign tissues. He said he'd explain in more detail if she agreed to take a look. Yunju remained silent. Then she stood up. She picked up her tool case. She said her workshop was closed, but she had her tools with her. She said she needed a workbench and a furnace. Tae Gon said his workshop had a table and a gas burner. Yinju looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Then she nodded. She followed him. Yinju spent 4 hours in the workshop. She didn't speak. She worked. She laid out her tools on the table. Hammers, pliers, files, all old. Hand-forging tools. Heirloom tools of the Chamyokan dynasty. A century and a half of history in every handle. She picked up the dragon scale first. She heated it over the gas torch. The torch was weak. For proper forging, you need a forge with a temperature of 1,200 degrees. The gas burner only reached 600. But Yinju worked with what she had. She heated it. She forged it. She let it cool. She heated it again. Tae Gon watched. He didn't interfere. He saw how she moved. Precisely. Efficiently. Every hammer strike landed exactly where it was needed. Not a single wasted movement. She was a master. A true one. One of those whom the system cannot evaluate because the system evaluates skill level, not craftsmanship. 4 hours later, a plate lay on the table. Thin, flat, with a dragon scale pattern, but modified. Yinju had reforged the structure. She made it denser, stronger, more beautiful. Tae Gon took the plate in his hands. He looked at it. He closed his eyes. The autopsy room. And he saw something impossible. The plate had its own evolutionary tree. The dead material, rejected by his body after Yinju's forging, had acquired the structure of a living thing. A single branch, thin, in its infancy, but a branch nonetheless. Yinju had breathed life into the dead. Tae Gon opened his eyes. He looked at Yinju. She was wiping her hands with a rag and staring at the plate, waiting for his assessment. Tae Gon bowed, deeply, to the floor. His forehead touched the concrete. Yinju froze. Tae Gon spoke without raising his head. He said he had seen the evolution of a dragon, that what she had made of it was more beautiful than what the dragon might have become, that her lineage was alive. Yinju stood there. She didn't move. The rag was still in her hands. Then she sat down on a chair, slowly. She placed her hands on her knees. She lowered her head. Her shoulders didn't shake. She cried silently, absolutely soundlessly. Tae Gon got up from the floor and left the workshop. He stood by the door outside. He waited. 20 minutes later, Yinju came out. Her eyes were dry. Her back was straight. She said she needed a kiln, a real one, that a gas burner was an insult to the material. Tae Gon said that a forge cost money he didn't have. Unju replied that she had a forge, in the old workshop. The workshop was closed, but the equipment was still inside. The rent was paid for another year. She proposed a barter. He would give her material from his evolutions. She would forge whatever he asked for. Tae Gon agreed. Yinju nodded. She gathered her tools and left. A plate remained on the table, a dragon scale reforged by the blacksmith's hands, alive. For the next 2 weeks, Tae Gon worked in 2 shifts. During the day, fulfilling orders in the workshop. At night, he met with the team. So-yun came every other day. She drew blood. She checked the integration level of the 4 evolutions. She recorded the data. Her notebook had grown to 50 pages. Graphs, formulas, observations. She worked like a researcher with a single test subject. Tae Gon didn't mind. Her data was useful. It showed that his body was in equilibrium. The 4 evolutions weren't in conflict, but the equilibrium was fragile. So-yun calculated that the 5th evolution would require twice as much substrate. The 6th, 3 times as much. Geometric progression. The components for the substrate are expensive, rare. So-yun's supplies aren't infinite. A constant source is needed. Tae Gon had been thinking about this. Jia was working too. She took charge of reconnaissance. The map of Seoul and its surroundings on her tablet was becoming covered with markers. The blue dots were bushes that the guilds considered cleared. The red ones were dungeons where Jia had detected activity. The yellow ones were auctions and black markets where materials were sold. She worked at night. She'd leave in the evening and return around dawn. She always carried the demon bone knives with her, all 6 of them. She never came back empty-handed. Every time she brought back information, coordinates and the names of the couriers, patrol schedules. Jia couldn't see the system, and the system couldn't see her. That made her the perfect scout. Not a single tracker recorded her movements. Not a single scanner reacted to her presence. She came and went like a ghost. Gain trained. Every morning on the roof of the building, Tae Gon could hear her through the ceiling. The blows, footsteps, rolling movements. She was getting back into shape. A year and a half of inactivity, alcohol, insomnia. The body of a former S-rank raider remembered everything, but her muscles had lost their edge. She trained hard. No cutting corners. Tae Gon climbed onto the roof every morning with 2 containers of rice. One for her, one for himself. He'd set the container on the parapet. Then he'd leave. No comments, no offers to help, just rice. Every day. Gae-in would take the container. She never once thanked him, but she never once left it behind. At the end of the 2nd week, Eunju brought the first real order. A sword. Not made from fragments of Tae Gon's evolutions, but from ordinary steel, though forged in her furnace with the addition of shards from a demon's bone armor. The sword was for gain. Yinju said she'd heard from Tae Gon that there was a melee fighter on the team, that this fighter needed a weapon. She came to the workshop in the evening when everyone was there. So-yeon was at the table with a notebook. Jia was on a box with a vape. Gain was by the wall with a cigarette. Yinju walked in. She bowed to each one, separately, by name, with a respectful honorific. Even to Jia, who was 4 years younger. She placed the sword on the table, unwrapped the cloth. The blade was dark, matte, with a subtle pattern through which the lines of bone armor could be discerned. Gae-in approached. She took the sword, raised it, twirled it, made 2 movements quick and precise. The air whistled. Gae-in lowered the sword. She looked at Yinju. She said one word. Good. Yinju nodded. She didn't smile, but her back straightened slightly. That night, they sat together for the first time. Not for any particular reason, they just sat there. Tae Gon brewed tea. So-yeon brought rice cakes. Jia brought a bag of tangerines. Yinju sat upright and drank her tea with both hands, as if in a ceremony. Ga-in sat on the floor by the wall with a sword on her lap. They were silent. They drank tea. They ate tangerines. The workshop smelled of pine needles from So-yeon's growing medium, burnt metal from Yinju's tools, Jia's vape and cigarettes, and the formaldehyde from the cutting table. Tae Gon sat in the middle and watched them. 4 women. An alchemist whose brother had taken his own life because of the system's evaluation. A scout whom the system hadn't even registered. A blacksmith whose family went bankrupt because the guilds took all their orders. A raider whose partner died because his rank wasn't high enough for evacuation. 4 people whom the system had told were not good enough. Tae Gon didn't say this out loud. He didn't give a speech. He didn't announce a goal. He just poured some more tea, handed out tangerines, washed the cups after everyone left, lay down on the cutting table, closed his eyes, fell asleep. For 2 weeks, So-yeon prepared the substrate for the prosthesis. Tae Gon gave her all the discarded fragments of the crab's evolution, 7 pieces of chitin saturated with regenerative tissue. So-yeon worked in her home laboratory. Tae Gon only saw her when she came by for new blood samples. Each time, she looked paler. She slept little. She ate little. Tae Gon told her she needed to rest. So-yeon didn't respond. She just kept working. On the 10th day, she came to the workshop and said she needed a fresh sample. Not blood, bone marrow, from the fragment of crab evolution that still lives inside him. Tae Gon asked how to extract it. So-yeon said she needed a biopsy, a needle into the bone. Painful, dangerous. If she missed the mark, she could damage the integration. Tae Gon said he trusted her. So-yeon looked at him. Her hands were shaking. For the first time. She said she wasn't sure. Tae Gon said he was confident in her. So-yeon took out the needle. A long one. A surgical needle. Tae Gon took off his shirt. So-yeon found the spot on his rib where the crab tissue had integrated most tightly. She inserted the needle. Tae Gon didn't scream. He clenched his teeth. He gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white. So-yeon extracted the sample. 5 milliliters of bone marrow mixed with crab regenerative tissue. Pink in color, pulsating, alive. She removed the needle. She dressed the wound. Tae Gon exhaled. So-yeon looked at the sample in the test tube. Her hands were no longer shaking. On the 14th day, the substrate was ready. So-yeon brought it to the workshop in a special thermally insulated container. Inside was an ampule filled with a thick pink liquid. Tae Tae Gon called for the one-armed hunter. The man arrived an hour later. He sat down in a chair. He looked at the ampule. Tae Gon explained. The substrate wouldn't grow a hand. It would trigger a process in the nerve endings of the stump that would create a living framework, a biological foundation for the prosthesis. The framework would be able to feel, transmit signals, and respond to the brain's intentions. Not a fully functional hand, but a foundation that works. The man asked how much it would cost. Tae Gon said it was free. The man didn't believe him. Tae Gon repeated, "Free." So-yeon injected the substrate into the stump. The man clenched his teeth. He turned pale. 5 minutes later, thin threads began to emerge from the edge of the stump. Pink, translucent. They grew slowly, stretching out 2 centimeters, 3, 5. Then they stopped. The framework, biological reinforcement, alive. The man stared at his stump, holding his breath. Then he touched the filaments. They moved, slightly, but they moved. They obeyed his will. The man raised his head. His eyes were wet. He didn't cry. He stood up. He bowed. He left. So-yeon sat in a chair and stared at the wall. Tae Gon approached her. He asked if everything was all right. So-yeon didn't answer right away. Then she said that her brother had dreamed of this, creating a substrate that heals rather than merely stabilizes, one that restores rather than merely sustains. He had submitted a proposal to Taeyang, a bio-regeneration project for wounded hunters. They turned him down. They wrote that the return on investment was negative. He resubmitted it. They turned him down again. The third time, they didn't even review his proposal. 2 months later, he took his own life. Tae Gon sat down next to her. He didn't speak. He just sat there. So-yeon stood up. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to a blank page. She wrote a title, Restoration Project, Protocol 1. She closed the notebook. She looked at Tae Gon. His eyes were dry. His back was straight. She said she needed more samples. Tae Gon nodded. The news spread quickly. A boy from the neighborhood told his mother. His mother told her neighbor. The neighbor told her husband. A week later, 3 people came to the workshop. A former hunter with a damaged spine. A woman whose son had lost his sight after a botched initiation. An old man who simply wanted to ask if the butcher could take a look at his grandson. Tae Gon saw each of them. He didn't promise miracles. He didn't offer guarantees. He looked. He scanned. He described what he saw, honestly. He told the man with the spinal injury that his case was beyond his current capabilities. Crab regeneration works on limbs, not the spinal cord. But he said he was looking for a solution. He told the woman that her son's vision was damaged not physically, but systemically. The initiation had burned the optic nerve with an energy surge. This was a different type of injury. It requires a different approach. She started crying. Tae Gon gave her some tea. He told her he wasn't giving up. He just couldn't do it yet. She left with the tea in a thermos. The old man from the neighborhood came by in the evening, alone, small, hunchbacked. He sat down at the table in the workshop. He took a student ID badge out of his pocket. He placed it in front of Tae Gon. He said his grandson had taken his own life a week ago, 14 years old. The initiation had taken place 3 months ago. Result, 0. Carrier incompatibility. The same words Tae Gon had received 10 years ago. The boy came home after the initiation. He was silent for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he hanged himself in the bathroom. The old man didn't cry. He spoke calmly, quietly. He made a request. He said he'd heard that the divider understood evolution. He asked if his grandson had even the slightest branch, any at all. Tae Gon closed the workshop. He hung up a closed sign. He sat down across from the old man. He set a cup of tea in front of him. He took the badge in his hands. He closed his eyes. A residual tree pattern from blood on the object. Faint, almost invisible. The boy had died a week ago. The traces were fading, but Tae Gon kept looking. He strained his detection section to the limit, and he saw it. The boy's tree. Delicate, fragile, like a spiderweb. One main branch, blocked by the system, marked as incompatible. But behind the block, deep, like a seed beneath a layer of concrete, a branch, golden, alive, a branch of empathy. The boy could have felt the emotions of living creatures, not humans, monsters. He could have understood what a monster feels before death, what a dragon feels when its core fades, what a wolf feels when its gland is shattered. An extremely rare branch, unique. The system blocked it because this gift didn't fit into any class. Because a boy who feels the pain of monsters is useless to guilds, useless for raids, useless for the economy. The system labeled him a 0. But he could have become the one who understands. Tae Gon opened his eyes. An hour had passed. The old man sat motionless, waiting. Tae Gon began to speak, quietly, in detail. He described the branch of empathy. He described what color the boy's aura would be at the third stage. Warm, golden, like the morning light. He described which class was emerging through the incompatibility. A listener. Not an observer like Tae Gon. A listener. One who hears what monsters cannot say. He described what this boy could become. Not strong, not fast, not dangerous. Needed, not indispensable. The one without whom the raiders would kill monsters without knowing what they feel. Without knowing that they, too, want to live. Tae Gon wasn't lying. He truly saw it. The old man listened, holding his cup with both hands. When Tae Gon finished, the old man finished his tea. He stood up. He bowed. He said thank you. Tae Gon gave him a thermos of tea. The old man left. Footsteps on the street. Slow, heavy, but steady. The next morning, there was a line outside the workshop. 7 people. By lunchtime, 12. By evening, there were 20. People from the Manhwa district, from neighboring neighborhoods, former hunters, parents of the nulls, wives of fallen raiders, elderly people whose grandchildren had failed their initiation, all with the same question. Tell me, did he have a branch? Tell me, could he have become someone? Tell us his life wasn't empty. Tae Gon received everyone, from morning until night. So-yeon stood in the doorway and watched the line. Ji-ah approached and stood beside her. So-yeon said to her quietly, she said he wasn't gathering a harem. He was gathering people who had been told they didn't exist. Ji-ah didn't answer. She chewed on a tangerine. She looked at the line. Tae Gon hadn't slept for 2 days. He received 43 people. He read 43 residual trees. He told each one, honestly. In 37 of them, he found unrealized branches. In 6, he found nothing. To those 6, he told the truth. He said he couldn't see anything. That perhaps there had been a branch, but it had withered away. That perhaps the system hadn't made a mistake. He didn't offer false comfort. 4 of the 6 nodded and left. 2 of them started crying. Tae Gon gave them some tea. He waited. He walked them to the door. On the 3rd morning, he collapsed. Just like that. He was standing at the table, preparing his tools for the next visitor, when his legs gave out. He crashed onto the concrete floor. Se-yeon was there within a minute. She checked his pulse and blood pressure, his temperature. She said he was exhausted. The autopsy department was draining his resources. 4 physical transformations in his body could compensate for a lot, but not for sleeplessness or hunger. She ordered him to lie down. Tae Gon started to get up. So-yeon placed her hand on his shoulder. Their first physical contact ever. She said 2 words. Lie down, now. Tae Gon lay down on the dissection table. He fell asleep in 4 seconds. Tae Gon knew time was running out. Taeyang hadn't just noticed him. Taeyang had started gathering information. Ga-in knew how the guild's intelligence operation worked. First, they send observers, ordinary employees with no authority. They watch. They take notes. They report to analysts. The analysts compile a report. The report goes up the chain. If the target is of interest, they take it on. If it's dangerous, they send in the White Key, a cleanup squad. Elite enforcers who eliminate the awakened who aren't integrated into the guild system. Ga-in said that from the observer's visit to the White Key's visit usually takes between 2 and 6 weeks. It depends on how quickly the analysts figure out what's going on. Tae Gon asked how long she estimated it would take. Ga-in thought for a moment. She said a month at most. The observers had seen the line. They'd seen people coming to the former janitor and leaving with different faces. The analysts would want to know why. Tae Gon nodded. A month. They had a month to prepare. The first thing he did was change the workshop's operating schedule. During the day, it would operate as usual. Visitors would be received only in the evenings, through the back door. Ji-ah organized the system. Each visitor would arrive at a scheduled time, not in a crowd, but one at a time. No line at the door. Discreetly. Ji-ah knew how to avoid drawing attention. She'd been doing this her whole life. Second, Tae Gon asked Ga-in to draw up an evacuation plan for the workshop. 3 routes, through the roof, through the basement, and through the neighboring yard. Guyan walked each route herself, timed it, and noted the bottlenecks. 2 days later, the plan was ready. 4 minutes to a safe zone via any of the routes. Third, Tae Gon asked Yinju to put together a set of gear, not weapons, tools. A field butchering kit, compact, lightweight, the kind you could take with you into the underground. Yinju nodded and went to work. The fourth point was the most important. Tae Gon needed the fifth evolution, not for himself, for the team. The first 4 evolutions gave him endurance, hearing, protection, regeneration, but none of them provided the most important thing, the ability to see in the dark, to hide, to vanish. If the white key came, he would need to leave, to fade away, to become invisible. Ji-Ah was invisible to the system, but he was not. The system couldn't scan him, but human eyes could see him perfectly well. He needed camouflage, optical and biological, that very prototype of a camouflage system he'd seen in the S-rank Dark Mantis at the Taeyang laboratory. But S-rank was too low. The inheritance ritual only worked with monsters of A-rank or higher. Tae Gon reread his notes, he checked the catalog, and he found it. Not the mantis, something else. An A-rank mirror moth. A species that inhabited the high-altitude caves of Gangwon province. Rare, nearly extinct. Its wings refracted light so that the moth became invisible in flight. Current ability. But the unrealized branch was more interesting. The moth was preparing for an evolution in which not only itself, but also the space around it within a 3-meter radius would become optically invisible. An invisibility field. Mobile. Controllable. Problem. A-rank mirror moth. Rare, lives in high-altitude dungeons, controlled by the Chonryon Guild, the second giant. Tae Gon couldn't buy it at auction. He couldn't send Ji-Ah to scout Chonryon's territory. This wasn't Baeko with its corrupt drivers. Chonryon controlled its territories strictly, with guards at every entrance, patrols every 2 hours. Tae Gon thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, Guyan came up with a solution. She was sitting on the roof, cleaning her sword, when Tae Gon came up with some rice. She said she'd overheard his conversation with Ji-Ah through the floor, that she had a contact, a former colleague from Taeyang who had defected to Chaehongrian a year ago. A B-rank raider, not a high rank, but high enough to have access to the schedule for high-altitude dungeon sweeps. Tae Gon asked if he could be trusted. Gain replied briefly. She said he owed her his life. She'd pulled him out of a cave-in 4 years ago. He hadn't forgotten. Tae Gon nodded. A week later, Gain received the information. A sweep of the high-altitude dungeon in Gangwon province was scheduled for the following Thursday. A-rank mirror moths had been spotted in the deepest section. 3 specimens. After the sweep, the trophies would be sent to the Cheongryong laboratory in Chuncheon. But there was a window of opportunity between the dungeon and the laboratory. A 4-hour drive along a mountain road. 1 truck, 2 guards. The standard route. Gain knew this route. She had traveled it when she worked on joint operations between Taeyang and Chongryong. Tae Gon looked at her. She understood without words. She said this wasn't a simple theft of 300,000 won from a driver. This was an ambush on a convoy belonging to the Second Giant's Guild. If they got caught, it wouldn't be a fine. It would be death. Tae Gon replied that he knew. Guyan was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said she was going with him. Tae Gon didn't argue. On Thursday morning, they were at the location. A mountain road in Gangwon province. Narrow, winding, forest on both sides. Ji-Ah found the spot. A curve where the truck slows down to 20 kilometers per hour. A blind spot for the cameras. 2 minutes to the next patrol post. Guyan stood behind a tree by the roadside, fully prepared for combat. A sword made of demon bone hung at her belt. Tae Gon stood beside her, unarmed, wearing a work jacket, with a pocket knife in his pocket. Ji-Ah sat in a tree 20 meters away, looking through her binoculars. The truck appeared at 11:23. A standard refrigerated truck with the Cheongryong logo. 2 security guards in the cab. Both were C-rank. Ji-Ah gave the signal. Guyan stepped out onto the road. The driver saw the woman on the road and slammed on the brakes. The security guard on the right opened the door. He stepped outside. He asked what had happened. Guyan replied that a tree had fallen just past the turn. She pointed. The security guard turned his head. Guyan moved quickly. Even after a year and a half of inactivity, she remained an S-rank. 2 strikes, with an open palm, to the pressure points on their necks. Both guards lost consciousness in a second. It didn't hurt. It wasn't dangerous. They just shut down. Gain put them back in the cab. Tae Gon opened the refrigerated compartment. Containers, 6 of them, labeled. He found the one he needed by the label. Mirror moth, A-rank, specimen 3. He opened it. Inside was the moth's carcass, its wings folded, silvery, iridescent, dead for 4 hours. The core had been removed, but the head was intact. Tae Gon closed his eyes. Autopsy section. The moth's body was fragile and beautiful, like stained glass, and the golden branch on it shone brightly. the field of optical invisibility. The gland at the base of the antennae, intact. Tae Gon took out a pocket knife. He cut open the moth's head. He found the gland. 2 minutes. The ritual of inheritance. The moth silhouette rose above the carcass, invisible, literally. The silhouette flickered, vanished, and reappeared. Beautiful, like a ghost of light. The silhouette entered Tae Gon. The pain was subtle, superficial. Skin, all of his skin. Every cell of his epidermis reorganized itself. For a second, Tae Gon became translucent. Guyan could see the forest through him. Then he became visible again. Control came instantly. The interface flashed. Evolution accepted. Optical adaptation field. Stage unstable. 72 hours. Tae Gon closed the container. He shut the refrigerated unit. Ji-Ah jumped down from the tree. Gain checked on the guards. Heart rate steady. They'll wake up in 20 minutes. They won't remember faces. The three of them went into the forest. 5 minutes later, the truck was left behind. White Key arrived in 3 weeks. Not in a month as Gain had predicted. Sooner. That meant Taeyang's analysts had noticed more than just the line outside the workshop. They'd noticed something else. Tae Gon found out about this from Ji-Ah. She came to the workshop at 5 in the morning, without knocking, through the window. She woke him up by yanking his shoulder. She said 2 words. "They're here." Tae Gon got up. He didn't ask any questions. Ji-Ah explained quickly. 4 of them, all S-rank, positioned at 2 locations. 2 on the roof of the building across the street, 2 in a van at the intersection. A standard White Key formation. Block and sweep. Ji-Ah saw them because the system didn't detect her. She walked past the van just a meter away, and no one reacted. The scanners didn't pick her up. To them, she was invisible. Tae Gon called Guyan. She picked up on the first ring. She said she could see them from the roof. 2 upstairs across the street with long-range artifacts. 2 downstairs with heavy close combat gear. Standard White Key tactics. First, immobilize the target from a distance, then move in and finish them off. Quickly, cleanly, no witnesses. Gain said time was running out. Dawn would break in an hour. They operate in the dark. Tae Gon thought for 30 seconds. Then he made a decision. Don't run, don't hide. Face them head on. Gain asked if he was serious. Tae Gon replied that he was. He had 5 evolutions. A demon's bone armor for defense. A moth's invisibility field for camouflage. A wolf's echolocation for detection. A crab's regeneration in case of injury. Dragon gills for endurance. He wasn't a fighter, but he wasn't defenseless either. Gain was silent for 5 seconds. Then she said she was coming down. Tae Gon left the workshop, alone, out onto street, at 3 in the morning. Mafo was asleep. Every other streetlight was on. He stood under the sign. Carcass butchering and disposal. Inexpensive. And he waited. His echolocation picked up everything. 4 heartbeats. 2 on the roof. 2 in the van. All 4 quickened when he stepped into the light. They hadn't expected the target to come out on his own. Tae Gon stood and waited. 1 minute. 2. 3. In the 4th minute, the van door opened. A man stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, short hair, a Taeyang Guild tattoo on his wrist, an S-rank awakened of the Berserker class, leader of the White Key squad. Tae Gon had seen him before, in the lab. This man used to bring in trophies after mop-up operations. He'd stack the corpses on the floor without looking, then he'd leave. He'd never noticed the janitor before. The leader stopped 5 meters away. He looked at Tae Gon. He scanned him. The interface above Tae Gon's head displayed the usual information. Observer, level 1, ceiling 1, 0 threat. The leader frowned. He said he had orders. A former Taeyang employee was suspected of illegally using monster materials. A search of the premises and an interrogation were required. Tae Gon replied calmly. He asked if there was a warrant. The leader didn't answer. White Key didn't work with warrants. White Key worked with orders. Tae Gon nodded. He said he understood. Then he did something the leader didn't expect. He closed his eyes, opened them, and began to speak. He said the leader's name. Kang Do-hoon, S-rank, Berserker, growth ceiling, SS. Current level, 47. The leader froze. Tae Gon continued. He described his evolutionary tree, out loud, calmly, like a lecture. The Berserker's main branch, enhanced musculature, pain tolerance, adrenaline surge, fully realized. Secondary branch, bone density, 70% realized. And further, the Golden Branch, unrealized. The next stage of Berserker evolution, controlled transformation, not blind rage, but managed rage. A Berserker who thinks during battle, who chooses rather than simply destroys. Kang Do-hoon could have become the first berserker in history not to lose his mind upon activation. But the branch is blocked, not by the system, artificially. Someone placed a block. The leader stood motionless. Tae Gon saw his face in the lantern light, pale, tense, his jaw muscles clenched. Tae Gon continued. He said the block had been set 10 years ago, during a re-evaluation, a standard Taeyong procedure for S-rank employees. The evaluator examines the tree and decides which branches to develop and which to block. A controlled transformation is dangerous for a berserker. Not for the berserker, for the guild. A berserker who thinks is a berserker who can say no. The guild doesn't want its weapons to think. That's why the branch was blocked. The evaluator signed the report. The evaluator's name? Cho Han Bin, Vice President of Taeyong. Kang Do-hoon stood frozen in place. Tae Gon fell silent. He waited. Do-hoon turned his head toward the van. A second enforcer stood by the door listening. On the roof, 2 others were listening as well. Echolocation picked up their heartbeats. All 4 were racing. Do-hoon turned back to Tae Gon. He asked how he knew that. Tae Gon replied simply. He said he could see it. Do-hoon asked if he could remove the block. Tae Gon shook his head. He said he couldn't. His ability allowed him to see and collect the unrealized evolutions of monsters, not humans. But he could show where the block was located. And if Do-hoon found an alchemist of a high enough rank, that person could try. Do-hoon was silent for a minute, a whole minute. Then he took a step back. He turned toward the van. He got inside. The door closed. 3 minutes later, the van drove off. The 2 on the roof followed. Tae Gon stood alone on the street. His hands were shaking. He hid them in his pockets. Gayan came down a minute later. She stood beside him. She watched the van drive away. She said he was crazy. Tae Gon replied that he knew. Gayan said that White Key would return. Not this squad, another one. Tae Gon replied that he knew. Gayan said that next time, they wouldn't talk. Tae Gon replied that he knew. Gayan looked at him. She said that he won not through strength, but because he knew more about them than they knew about themselves. Tae Gon didn't reply. He stared at the empty street. A streetlight flickered. Gayan went upstairs. Tae Gon returned to the workshop. He sat down on the table. He closed his eyes. The 5 evolutions hummed within his body. For the first time in months, he thought of Cho Han Bin, Vice President Tae Yang, the man who, 10 years ago, wrote the report declaring him unfit. The man who blocks the advancement of his own employees. The man whom the system once called an S-rank evaluator. Tae Gon didn't know the whole truth yet. He didn't know that Han Bin had stolen someone else's class. He didn't know about the boy Park Jin-woo. But he sensed that behind his 0 verdict lay not a mistake, but a decision. Someone's decision. The first students arrived a week later. Jia found them in the way only she knew how. At night in the alleys of Mafo, Yonsan, and Mapodokyo. In homeless shelters. In the lines for free food at temples. On benches by the closed portals of dungeons where former awakened ones sat and stared at the walls that had once opened for them. She was looking for a specific type of person. Not those who were angry at the system. There were plenty of angry ones. She was looking for those who were bored. Those who looked at monsters not with hatred, but with curiosity. Those who asked questions the guilds deemed pointless. Why does the stone scorpion have 8 legs when 6 would be more efficient? Why does the swamp boa have thermoreceptors if it's cold-blooded? Why does the bone wolf howl before molting? The questions of a biologist. The questions of a scientist. Questions from a person who sees a monster not as a sack of meat, but as a living creature. She found 7 in a week. 3 former low-ranking hunters written off after being wounded. 2 zeros after initiation. 1 former lab technician from Chongryong, fired for writing a report on the monster's unusual behavior. 1 old man. The very same one. The grandfather of the boy who took his own life. He came and said he wanted to understand. He wanted to know what his grandson had seen. He wanted to learn to see the way Tae Gon sees. Tae Gon accepted him first. The lessons took place in Unju's workshop. Every evening from 8 until midnight, Tae Gon taught. Not through the C system, through biology, through anatomy. Through the theory of evolution, he'd spent 10 years writing away in his desk drawer. The dissertation that would never be accepted became a textbook for the 7 people the system had written off. He started with the basics, the structure of a monster's body, the skeleton, the musculature, the nervous system, the core and its place in the overall anatomy. Then he moved on to evolutionary trees. He explained that every monster is not a static being with a fixed set of abilities, but a living process. That its current form is just one point on an infinite line of possibilities. That the core isn't a battery, but a decision-making hub. that the system evaluates results, not potential, and that the difference between results and potential is all that distinguishes a 0 rank from an S rank. The students listened. Some took notes, some just watched. The old man sat in the front row and didn't miss a single class. The lab assistant from Chongryon asked questions, lots of questions, sharp ones, professional ones. Tae Gon answered every one. On the third day, she brought her old report, the one that got her fired. A report on the unusual behavior of B-rank ice snakes in the dungeon beneath Daejeon. The snakes had begun building nests, not for breeding, but for molding, whether collective or not. The species was preparing for synchronized evolution, all individuals at the same time. The lab technician described this in her report. Her supervisor read it and said it was nonsense, that monsters don't evolve synchronously, that the system controls their development individually. The lab technician was fired. 3 months later, the snakes did indeed molt synchronously. The entire raiding party that entered the dungeon that day was killed, 12 people. The guild classified the incident as confidential. Tae Gon read the report. He looked up. He looked at the lab technician. Her name was Yoon So-hee, 31 years old, quiet, slouching, glasses. Tae Gon told her that her report was correct, that synchronous evolution is a real mechanism, that she had described something no guild analyst had seen because they don't view monsters as a species. They view them as individual units. Yoon So-hee took off her glasses. She wiped them, put them back on. Her eyes were red. She said that 12 people had died because they hadn't listened to her. Tae Gon replied that 12 people had died because the system they worked in didn't know how to listen, and that the academy would listen. Alongside his classes, Tae Gon was preparing for the next step. He knew that Taeyang wouldn't stop. The White Key had retreated, but Cho Han-bin wasn't the kind of person to let things go. Tae Gon began gathering information on Han-bin, not through Jia, but through So-yun. She had worked at Taeyang for 3 years. She had seen Han-bin at planning meetings. She knew the organization structure. She knew who reported to whom. She knew where the archives were kept. Tae Gon asked her to recall everything she knew about the initiation procedure at Taeyang. So-young spent 3 days recalling the details. She wrote them down. She brought him 14 pages. Tae Gon read through them and identified patterns. Every year, Taeyang held an initiation ceremony for a group of 14-year-olds. It was a standard procedure. The children enter the hall one by one. The evaluator scans them. The system assigns a class and a rank. The child leaves with a number above their head. For life. Taeyang's evaluator for the past 10 years, Cho Han-bin, personally, every child, every year. Tae Gon did the math. Roughly 1,500 children have passed through Han-bin's hands over the past 10 years. 1,500 destinies. Tae Gon asked Jia to find the lists, the names of the children who had undergone initiation through Taeyang over the past 10 years. And at the same time, the names of the children who received a 0 rating during the same period. Jia was gone for 3 days. She returned with a flash drive. There were 2 files on the flash drive. The list of those initiated, the list of those who scored 0. Tae Gon cross-referenced them and found it. Over the past 10 years, 1,472 children had passed through Taeyang. Of those, 114 received a 0 scores. Media incompatibility, 114 zeros in 10 years. That was 3 times the average for other guilds. 3 times. Tae Gon stared at the numbers and felt the demon's bony armor pressing against the skin on his hands. Not out of fear, out of the rage he wouldn't allow himself to show. 114 children. Some of them had taken their own lives, like the old man's grandson. Some had become janitors like he himself. Some had simply vanished. And behind each one stood Cho Han-bin, the evaluator, S rank, the man who decided which branches to develop and which to block, which children would become hunters and which would become zeros. Tae Gon closed the files. He put away the flash drive. He sat down at the table in the workshop. He thought for an hour. Then he called So-yun. He asked her to come over. She arrived 20 minutes later. Tae Gon asked if she could determine, based on a person's blood, whether there were artificial blocks in their system profile. So-yun thought for a moment. She said that, theoretically, yes. If a block is created alchemically, it leaves a trace in the blood, a specific marker. She can create a reagent that detects this marker, but she needs a blood sample from a person with a confirmed block. Tae Gon said said he knew such a person, Kang Do-hoon, the leader of the White Key. His branch has been blocked by Hanbin. If Do-hoon agrees to provide a blood sample for analysis, So-yeon will be able to create the reagent. Then, using this reagent, they can test the blood of any of the 114 zeros. And if they also have the marker, that's proof. Proof that Hanbin wasn't evaluating the children, he was maiming them. Kang Do-hoon came on his own, 2 weeks after the White Key's retreat, at night, alone, without his uniform, wearing a plain jacket and a cap. Jia spotted him 3 blocks away. She reported it to Tae Gon. Tae Gon told her to let him in. Ga-in stood by the door with her sword. Tae Gon shook his head. He said the sword wouldn't be needed. Ga-in sheathed it but remained by the wall. Do-hoon entered the workshop. He looked around. A cutting table, knives on the wall, the smell of formaldehyde and pine needles. He looked at Tae Gon. He looked at Ga-in. He recognized her. Former S-rank Tae-young. His face hadn't changed. He sat down on a chair. He was silent for a minute. Then he spoke. He said that after that night, he hadn't been able to sleep, that Tae Gon's words wouldn't leave his head. Controlled transformation. A thinking berserker. The branch that had been blocked for him. He checked. He went to an independent alchemist. He paid out of his own pocket. The alchemist confirmed it. There's an artificial block in his system profile, installed during a re-evaluation 10 years ago. The evaluator's signature, Cho Han-bin. Tae Gon listened without interrupting. Do-hoon continued. He said that throughout his entire career at White Key, he'd thought his rage was uncontrollable, that being a berserker was a curse, that without the guild collar, he would kill one of his own. That's what they told him. That's what was written in his profile. Uncontrollable aggression. External restraint required. He'd believed that for 10 years, and now he'd learned that his rage wasn't uncontrollable. They'd made it that way. On purpose. They'd blocked the control center and left only rage. They'd turned him into a weapon that couldn't be stopped. The perfect punisher. The perfect dog. Do-hoon fell silent. His hands rested on his knees. His knuckles were white. Tae Gon waited. Then he asked why he had come. Do-hoon answered directly. He said he wanted to help. Not out of gratitude. Out of rage. The very same rage that Hanbin had left him instead of self-control. Tae Gon nodded. He asked if he was ready to give a blood sample for analysis. Do-hoon rolled up his sleeve. So-yeon emerged from behind the desk where she had been sitting unnoticed the whole time. She drew his blood, 3 vials. Do-hoon didn't flinch. He stood up. He said he'd return when needed. He left. Ga-in watched him go. She remarked that this man had killed more awakened than any in Seoul. Tae Gon replied that for 10 years, this man had been a tool with no right to think. Ga-in didn't answer, but she sheathed her sword. So-yeon worked with Do-hoon's blood for 4 days. On the 5th day, she came to the workshop with the results. The marker existed. The alchemical unit left a specific protein in the blood. Unusual. Artificial. Nothing like it exists in nature. So-yeon created a reagent that changes color upon contact with this protein. The clear liquid turns red. A simple test. A drop of blood. A drop of reagent. Red means the block is present. Clear means it isn't. Tae Gon looked at the ampule containing the reagent. Small. Glass. Inside was a clear liquid. A weapon. Not a sword. Not a fist. An ampule. He asked So-yeon how much reagent she could produce. So-yeon replied that, given the necessary components, there was enough for 100 tests. Tae Gon said he needed 114. For the next 3 weeks, Tae Gon and Jia searched for the zeros, the very same 114 children that Hanbin had assessed over the course of 10 years. The children were no longer children. The youngest was 14. The oldest was 24. Just like Tae Gon. Jia found them using databases she had obtained through her own methods, orphanage archives, registration lists, and medical records. Some were easy to find. They lived in impoverished neighborhoods and held low-level jobs, day labor, cleaning, and food delivery. Others were impossible to find. They had died or taken their own lives. They had vanished. Out of 114, Jia found 71. Tae Gon contacted each one personally. He explained. He asked for a drop of blood. Not everyone agreed. Some didn't believe him. Some were afraid. But 43 agreed. 43 drops of blood. 43 tests. So-yeon conducted the tests in Yinju's workshop. Tae Gon stood nearby. Jia sat on a box. Ga-in stood by the wall. Yinju was in the corner. First drop, reagent, red. Second, red. Third, red. Fourth, clear. Fifth, red. Sixth, red. Tae Gon kept count. Out of 43 tests, 37 showed red. 37 out of 43 had the artificial block marker in their blood. 37 children whose evolutionary branches Cho Han Bin had blocked and written off as zeros. So-yeon placed the last test tube on the table. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice was steady. But she sat there, staring at the row of red test tubes and didn't move for 3 minutes. Then she took out her notebook. She wrote down the results. She closed it. She looked at Tae Gon. She asked what was next. Tae Gon replied, "Next is the tournament." Every year, Taeyang holds an exhibition tournament at the Koyama Dam Arena. A corporate spectacle, broadcast nationwide. Guilds demonstrate the strength of their raiders. S-rank fighters compete in exhibition matches. The audience cheers for the numbers above their heads. The tournament is in 2 months. Tae Gon plans to step into that arena, not to fight, but to speak. To reveal on camera that Taeyang's entire hierarchy is built on stolen branches and locked-up children. To show the test tubes, to show the markers, to show Hanbin. So-yeon said they'd kill him before he even reached the microphone. Tae Gon replied that he'd need a team for that. 2 months of preparation, 60 days, every minute scheduled. Tae Gon worked on 3 fronts simultaneously. First, evidence. So-yeon continued the tests. Jia found new zeros. By the end of the first month, 62 people had been tested, 51 with the marker. Every result was documented. Photos of the test tubes, names, dates of initiation, the evaluator's name, Cho Han Bin, in every case. So-yeon compiled a comprehensive report, 120 pages, with graphs, with formulas, with a description of the methodology, a scientific document that any laboratory could reproduce and verify. Tae Gon read the report and thought that So-yeon's brother would have been proud of this work. He didn't tell her, but he placed a container of kimchi jjigae from the boy's mother in the neighborhood next to the report. So-yeon looked at the container, then at the report. She opened the container and ate for the first time in 2 days. The second area, equipment. Unju was forging, every day, from morning until night. Using materials from Tae Gon's evolutions, she created things the world had never seen. A sword for Gaian, the second one, better than the first. Made from an alloy of dragon scales and demonic bone. A blade that emitted heat upon impact. Not fire, heat. Enough to soften enemy armor at the point of contact. Yinju named it the blacksmith's tooth. For Jia, a set of throwing needles made from crab chitin. Thin, invisible, with nerve fibers that vibrated when a living creature approached. Signal needles. Stick one in the wall and find out who's passing by. For So-yeon, a new type of alchemical injector, made from reforged demon bone. Bone capsules instead of glass vials. They don't break, they don't leak, they hold twice as much substance. For Tae Gon, a pocket knife, a new one. He'd carried the old one for 20 years, and the blade had worn down to a thread. Yinju reforged it. She kept the handle. She replaced the blade with an alloy of all 4 materials: dragon, demon, crab, and moth. 4 evolutions in a single blade. A knife that cut not just flesh, but structure. Tae Gon took the knife. He turned it over in his hands. Yinju stood beside him, straight and stern. She waited. Tae Gon said the blade was perfect. Yinju replied briefly. She said the blade was only as good as the hand that guided it. Tae Gon put the knife in his pocket. Yinju nodded and returned to the forge. The third direction, Madison Park. Maddie showed up 6 weeks before the tournament. Tae Gon wasn't expecting her. She came through So-yeon. They'd been writing to each other for a year. They exchanged formulas. They discussed substrates. So-yeon never once mentioned Tae Gon in their correspondence. But a week before her arrival, Maddie sent her a single message. "Come, there's a job for an engineer." Maddie flew in from Los Angeles on Thursday morning. She took a taxi to Mafo. She walked into the workshop carrying 2 suitcases and a backpack. Loud, energetic. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, coffee in her hand. She spotted the dissection table and said, in a mix of English and Korean, that this was the dirtiest lab she'd ever worked in. And she'd worked in the basement of Helios Guild in Los Angeles, where the rats were bigger than bone wolves. Tae Gon looked at her, unsure what to do. So-yeon approached. She introduced them. Tae Gon, dissection technician, biologist. Maddie, biomechanical engineer. Maddie shook his hand firmly. She asked what kind of work he did. So-yeon showed her the results of Tae Gon's tests. Maddie read for 2 minutes. Then she looked up. Her eyes were ablaze. She said it was impossible. 4 foreign biological systems in a single host without rejection. So-yeon replied that it was possible because he was standing right there in front of her. Maddie looked at Tae Gon with a different gaze, appraising, professional. She asked if she could take a look. Tae Gon raised his hand. He concentrated. His hand turned transparent. Maddie dropped her coffee. Over the next 4 weeks, Maddie turned the workshop into a second laboratory. From her suitcases, she pulled out equipment that Tae Gon had only seen in Taeyang catalogs. Portable scanners, microscopes, biometric sensors. She worked 20 hours a day. She slept 4. She drank coffee by the liter. She cursed when something didn't work out. She sang when it did. Her task was specific: to create a portable stabilizer injector for field conditions. Until then, every stabilization had required So-yeon's presence, ampules, manual administration, and dosage control. Maddie automated the process. An injector the size of a pen containing 3 doses of stabilizer. Automatic dosing based on the recipient's biometrics. A sensor on the wrist reads tissue condition and dispenses the substrate when needed. So-yeon brewed the substrate. Maddie filled the capsules with it. Inju forged the injector's casing from demon bone. The 3 masters worked like a well-oiled machine. Tae Gon watched. He helped where he could. He handed tools. He took out the trash. He brought food. His old habits as a janitor came in handy. On the very first day, Maddie called him Oppa. 3 days later, she started calling him Tai in the English style. A week later, she stopped noticing that he was standing nearby, watching her work. Then she'd notice and laugh. She'd say he looked at her schematics as if they were evolutionary trees with tenderness and admiration. Tae Gon would reply that good engineering and good biology looked the same. Maddie would fall silent. Then she worked even faster. 2 weeks before the tournament, the very thing Maddie had flown in for happened. A boy from the Mafo district, 12 years old. He'd lost his arm a year ago, not during a raid, on the street. A truck from the Baiko Guild was transporting waste from the dungeon. The container leaked. Acid from the core corroded the asphalt. The boy was walking home from school. He stepped on it. The acid corroded his leg up to the knee. Amputation. The guild paid compensation, a pittance. The boy's mother had come to see Tae Gon a month earlier. She stood in line asking him to take a look. Tae Gon remembered her. He called Maddie. Together, they assembled the first working prosthesis. Not a full leg, a frame, made from materials derived from Tae Gon's crab evolution, with nerve transfer, with So-yeon's biosubstrate, with bone joints from Inju, with biometric sensors from Maddie, a prosthesis that feels, that moves on the brain's command, that grows along with the child because crab regeneration adapts to the wearer's body. The boy came with his mother. So-yeon fitted the prosthesis. Maddie calibrated the sensors. Tae Gon held the boy's hand while he got used to the sensation. A new leg. Not real, but alive. The boy stood up, took a step, swayed, took another step. He walked. His mother covered her face with her hands. Maddie stood nearby and watched in silence. That evening, she bought a bottle of Macaulay. She sat alone in the workshop. Tae Gon came home late. She was drunk. Not very much, just a little. She spoke in English. She said he wasn't a hunter, that he was a repairman of the world. She said that she liked that. Tae Gon poured her some water. He said that repairmen need to sleep too. Maddie laughed. She finished the water. She lay down on the fold-out bed they'd set up for her in the corner. She fell asleep in a minute. Tae Gon covered her with his jacket. He turned off the light. He left. Lee Ha-sol found them 10 days before the tour. Not them, her. Her, them. A petite 19-year-old girl was standing at the workshop door at 7 in the morning, wearing headphones, in a huge, oversized jacket. Her eyes were huge, dark, tired. Dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. She stood there staring at the sign. Mascara, disassembly, and recycling. Inexpensive. Jia saw her first. She walked over, asked what she needed. Ha-sol took out one earbud. White noise hissed from the speaker. She said quietly that she'd seen this address. Not on the internet, not in an ad, in a dream, in one of the thousands of possible timelines that ran through her mind every second of every day. She saw house number 7 in Mafo. She saw the sign. She saw a man standing behind the dissection table, talking to dead monsters as if they were colleagues. And in that timeline where she approached this man, the noise in her head finally grew quieter. Ji-ah led her inside. Tae Gon came out of the back room. He saw Hasol. He closed his eyes for a second. The autopsy room. And he froze. Hasol's evolutionary tree was the brightest of any he had ever seen. S-rank seer, dozens of realized branches, probabilistic vision, tactical modeling, temporal intuition, but the tree looked sick. The branches burned too brightly, overloaded, unfiltered. Every branch was active simultaneously and wouldn't shut down. Hasol's brain was processing thousands of probabilistic lines in real time, without pause, without sleep, without silence. And amid this chaos, Tae Gon saw it, a golden branch, unmanifested, delicate, a filtering branch, a biological mechanism that would allow her to control the flow, to turn on the necessary lines, to turn off the unnecessary ones, to hear a single melody instead of an orchestra. The branch existed. It was ready for activation, but it wasn't activated because the Chongryon Guild was using Hasol as an oracle at full capacity. They didn't need a filter. They needed the stream. The more lines she saw, the more valuable she was to them. They weren't interested in what that did to her brain. Tae Gon opened his eyes. Hasol stood before him and watched, without blinking. She had already seen what he was going to say, in one of the lines, but she wanted to hear it with her own ears. Tae Gon spoke. He described the filtering branch. He described what it did. He explained that without it, Hasol's brain would work itself to the point of exhaustion until it broke down. Hasol nodded. She said she knew. That she had 3 years before she completely burned out. That's what the doctor in Chongyun had told her the day before she ran away. 3 years, and her brain would cease to function. Tae Gon asked if she was ready to try. Hasol asked what try meant. Tae Gon explained. His ability allows him to take in monsters' unrealized evolutions. But with Nixarat, the wolf, the demon, the crab, and the moth, he had taken what belonged to others. Hasol had her own branch, her very own. There's no need to take anything. She needs to complete it, to activate what the system and the guild had kept in dormant mode. He had never done this before. He didn't know if it would work, but he saw the way forward. With Soyun, the substrate, an alchemical catalyst that would trigger the branch's growth from within. Not a transplant of something foreign, but the awakening of her own. Soyoung listened in silence. When Tae Gon finished, she said she could try it. That the principle was the same. The substrate stimulates growth. Only instead of foreign tissue, it would stimulate the native tissue. A different composition was needed. 3 days to develop it. Hasol removed her second earbud. The white noise fell silent. She stood in the silence of the workshop, and her expression was such that Tae Gon looked away. Not out of awkwardness, but because looking at such hope was physically painful. 3 days later, Soyeon was ready. The substrate was transparent, like water, odorless, colorless. Soyeon said it was the purest mixture she'd ever concocted, nothing superfluous. Just a catalyst for one specific branch of one specific tree. Tae Gon sat down next to Hasol. He placed his hand on her shoulder. Soyeon injected the substrate. Hasol closed her eyes. Tae Gon closed his. Through the autopsy section, he saw how a golden branch inside Hasol's tree began to pulsate, to flare up, to grow, slowly, millimeter by millimeter. Neural connections were forming. A filtering system was taking shape between the cerebral cortex and the divination center. Tae Gon guided the process, not with force, with knowledge. He saw where the branch needed to grow. He saw the correct configuration. He prompted Soyeon when to add the catalyst, when to stop, when to wait. 2 hours. Soyeon administered 12 microdoses, precision work. At the very last minute, the branch fell into place. A golden line stretched across the entire tree and closed the circuit, the filter. Hasol opened her eyes. Silence. Not the white noise from her headphones. True silence inside, for the first time in 3 years. She looked at Tae Gon, then at Soyeon, then at the wall, at the ceiling, at her own hands. She saw a single line of probability. 1. Not 1,000. 1. The one she chose herself. Tournament day. The Koyama Dome Arena, the largest in Seoul, 40,000 spectators, broadcast across all of Korea and half of Asia. 3 giants representing the best fighters, Taeyang, Chonryon, Baekho, guild flags on the walls. Screens above the arena display the faces of S-rank raiders, levels, classes, win statistics. Numbers, numbers, numbers. The crowd is screaming, cameras are rolling, commentators are gushing with excitement. Strength, power, rankings. A world where the number above your head determines who you are. Tae Gon stood backstage, watching the arena through a slit in the curtain. Cho Hanbin sat in the VIP box on the second tier. Tae Gon could see him through echolocation. His heartbeat was steady, 68 beats per minute, calm, confident. Next to him were 3 assistants and 2 bodyguards, all S rank. Hanbin had organized a demonstration assessment, a special segment on the program. Former Taeyong employee Ryu Tae Gon had been summoned for a skills evaluation. That was the official wording. The official goal was simple: to put Tae Gon in front of the cameras, to show that he was a non-entity, a level 1 observer, no threat, close the case, send him back into the shadows. Hanbin didn't know that Tae Gon wanted the same thing, to step out in front of the cameras. The plan was simple. Tae Gon steps out. Facing him are 3 S-rank white key fighters. A new lineup, not Do-hoon's team, others. Hanbin didn't risk sending Do-hoon after what had happened. Tae Gon shouldn't fight. He should speak. Every second in the arena is a second on live TV. The cameras won't be turned off while the fight is going on. They won't be turned off as long as fighters are in the arena. So Tae Gon has to stay there. The team is buying him time. Ga-eun stood at the entrance to the arena. The blacksmith's toothed sword hung from her belt. Her face was stony. She told Tae Gon one thing. She said she'd give him 5 minutes. She wouldn't promise more. 3 S-rank fighters are no joke. Not even for a former S-rank fighter. Tae Gon replied that 5 minutes would be enough. Ga-eun nodded. Ji-ah-si was on the balcony with an escape map. 3 routes out of the arena, through the back rooms, through the parking lot, and through the ventilation shaft. Each had been scouted twice. So-yeon was holding a backup substrate, 6 vials in Yinjo's bone injector, in case Tae Gon needed urgent stabilization. Yinju stood backstage holding a bundle. Inside was a sword, the last one, the best one, a hybrid of all materials, a dragon, a demon, a crab, a butterfly. Yinju had forged it for 10 days. She hadn't slept for 3 days before finishing it. The sword wasn't for battle. The sword was a symbol. Everything Tae Gon had gathered, all the evolutions, all the futures that never happened. In a single blade, Maddie connected the injector to his wrist. 3 doses of stabilizer, automatic delivery. The sensor reads his biometrics. Hasal sat with her headphones on, but it was quiet in her headphones. The filter was working. She saw a single probability line, clear and distinct. She whispered to Tae Gon. The first fighter will attack from the right 3 seconds after entering the arena. The second is waiting. The third will flank from the left. They announced his name. Ryu Tae Gon, Observer, Level 1, Provisional Certification. The arena buzzed. Laughter. Whispers. A 0 in the arena. A joke. Tae Gon stepped out. The arena was enormous. White light. Sand on the floor. Screens broadcast his face throughout the stadium. Above his head, the familiar text hung in the interface. Observer. Level 1. Ceiling 1. 40,000 people saw the 1. 3 S-rank fighters entered from the opposite side. Young, fast, fully equipped. Levels 42, 45, 48. The arena roared. Yinju handed him the sword. Maddie checked the injector. Ji-ah took her position. So-yeon clutched the vials. Hasol whispered. To the right, 3 seconds. Ga-eun stepped into the arena. She stood before Tae Gon. Between him and the 3 S-ranks, alone, with a sword, the arena fell silent. Former C-rank Tae Yang, with Ga-eun. They remembered her. The commentators began whispering. What is she doing? Why is she with a 0 rank? Ga-eun raised her sword. The first S-rank attacked, from the right. Just as Hasol had said, Ga-eun blocked. The blade of blacksmith's tooth heated up at the point of contact. Sparks flew. The second S-rank fighter flanked her from the left. Gain spun around. 2 strikes. A block. A counterattack. The third S-rank fighter was waiting. Gain was fighting 1 against 2. She wasn't winning. She was holding her ground, buying time. Tae Gon didn't raise his sword. He raised his hand and spoke into the microphone built into the arena for fighters' commentary. His voice echoed throughout the stadium, across all the screens, throughout the entire broadcast. Calm, steady. The voice of a man who had silently scrubbed floors for 10 years and had finally spoken. He introduced himself. He said his name was Ryu Tae Gon, that he was a biologist, that he would like to give a short lecture on the evolutionary branches of the awakened present here. The hall fell silent. The commentators fell quiet. The cameras didn't cut away. The fight was still going on in the arena. The broadcast continued. Tae Gon began with Hanbin. He turned toward the VIP box. He raised his hand. He pointed, and he began to describe. out loud, in front of the cameras, with all the precision and detail afforded by 10 years of study and 5 evolutions. Cho Hanbin's evolutionary tree: S rank, appraiser class, main branch, ability to scan others' profiles, side branch, the ability to acquire fragments of others' classes through a re-evaluation procedure. Tae Gon spoke slowly, clearly, so that every spectator could hear. He described how this ability works. An evaluator scans a child during initiation, sees their tree, sees their potential, and if that potential is too dangerous for the guild or too valuable to leave with the child, Hanbin takes a fragment, blocks the branch, resets the child to 0. The child leaves with a 1 above their head. Hanbin leaves with yet another stolen fragment in his profile. The hall fell silent. Hanbin stood up in the VIP box. His face turned pale. His heart rate accelerated to 120. Tae Gon heard this through echolocation. He continued. He cited the figures. 114 children over 10 years. Of those, 51 had a confirmed marker of an artificial implant. He showed an ampule containing a reagent. He showed a red test tube. He explained what it was. An alchemical test, simple and reproducible. Any laboratory could verify it. So-yeon had sent the report to 3 extended institutes earlier that morning. The data is already publicly available. Then Tae Gon said a name. Park Jin-woo, 14 years old. Initiation 12 years ago. Initiation result determined by Hanbin. Carrier incompatibility, 0. The boy's true class. The unfinished carrier. The same class as Tae Gon's. Hanbin saw this class. He was terrified. A class that allows one to absorb others' evolutions. A class that renders the entire guild hierarchy meaningless. He blocked the boy's branch. He demoted him to 0. He took the class fragment for himself. The boy took his own life 2 months later. The arena was silent. 40,000 people. Silence. One of the 3 S ranks in the arena lowered his weapon. He looked at Tae Gon. He looked at Hanbin's box. Ga-in stood with her sword raised, breathing heavily, blood on her cheek, a cut on her shoulder, but she stood her ground. The 2 remaining S ranks exchanged glances. They didn't attack. Hanbin, in the box, grabbed his assistant by the sleeve. He was shouting something. Tae Gon couldn't make out the words. He could only hear his heartbeat. 100 beats. Panic. Tae Gon turned toward the camera. He said his final words. He said his name was Ryu Tae Gon, that his level was 1, that his ceiling was 1, and that he was the one who had just shown everyone that their hierarchy was built on stolen children. He gave the address of the workshop, Mafo, Taihani District, Building 7. He said that if anyone had their class taken away, they should come. He knows how to get it back. He lowered his sword, turned toward the exit, walked away. 1 step, another. A third. One by one they lined up behind him and followed. So-yeon led the way. Behind her were Eunju and Maddie. Jia came down from the balcony. Ha-Sol took off her headphones. Ga-in sheathed her sword and brought up the rear. 7 people were leaving the arena. Cameras filmed their backs. The hall was silent. And at that moment, something happened above Tae Gon's head that no one had seen in 17 years. The system interface flickered. The number 1 disappeared. The letters vanished. Class. Level. Cap. Everything vanished. An empty space. Blank. Like a page before the first word. The arena screens showed a close-up of it. A person with no level. Not 0, not 1. Emptiness. The cameras didn't shut off. 40,000 people stared at the empty space above his head and fell silent. Somewhere far away, in the mountains of Patagonia, the world boss opened his eyes and turned his head eastward. 3 days had passed since the tournament. The world had changed. Not entirely, not all at once, but a crack had formed. The recording of Tae Gon's performance in the arena racked up 200 million views in the first 24 hours. 3 independent laboratories confirmed So-yeon's protocol. The marker for the artificial block was detected. The reagent works. The results are reproducible. The Hunters Association launched an investigation. Cho Hanbin has been detained. He wasn't formally arrested because the guilds had been above the law for 17 years. And there was simply no legal mechanism for arresting an S-rank vice president. But he has been detained, stripped of his authority, suspended. His aides testified on the very first day, 4 out of 5. The 5th one fled. Tae Gon wasn't celebrating. He was sitting in his workshop in Mafo, butchering the carcass of an E-rank sewer rat for a kid from the neighborhood, the very same one who had once brought a skeleton from the dump. The kid stood nearby and watched. He asked about the structure of the skull. Tae Gon explained. Patiently, in detail. Just like in a lecture, the boy took notes in his notebook. An ordinary day, ordinary work. The sign on the door was the same, carcass processing and disposal. inexpensive. So-yeon arrived around lunchtime, with a notebook, 200 pages, complete documentation of the restoration project, 3 protocols, a bioregenerative substrate for limbs, a catalyst to activate the dormant branches of the awakened, a reagent to detect artificial blocks, 3 tools her brother had dreamed of creating. She placed the notebook on the table in front of Tae Gon. She said she wanted to publish it, under 2 names, hers and her brother's, Im Jong-hoon. Tae Gon looked at the notebook. He looked at her. He nodded. So-yeon took the notebook. She stopped at the door. She turned around. She said that his substrate for dragon fabric, the first one, was still the best of all the ones she'd created. She was trying to figure out why. Tae Gon replied that maybe it was because she'd brewed it not for a task, but for a person. So-yeon looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she left. Her footsteps on the street were steady, quick, confident. Yinju arrived after lunch, with blueprints. She had designed a new forge, not in the basement, a real one, with a smelting furnace, a workshop, and a training hall. She wanted to teach, not just blacksmithing, to teach others how to work with monster materials the way she did, with respect, with an understanding of the structure, with the sense that dead material can be brought to life if you know where to strike with the hammer. Tae Gon looked at the blueprints. A 3-story building. The first floor, the forge and workshop. The second floor, classrooms. The third floor, living quarters for the students. He asked where she planned to build it. Yinju replied that she'd found a plot, near Tae Gon's house, across the street, a former laundromat. It's been vacant for 2 years. The rent is affordable. Tae Gon nodded. Yinju bowed and left, her back straight, a heavy tool bag slung over her shoulder. A century and a half of the Cha Myo-kan family's history made its way through the streets of Mafo toward the new forge. Maddie left the day after the tournament, back to Los Angeles. But before she left a box in the workshop. Inside were 12 portable injectors, ready to use, loaded with So-yeon substrate, equipped with biometric sensors, with instructions in Korean and English. She wrote a note, a short one, in English, for Thai. The first batch. I'll send the next one in a month. I'm opening a branch in Los Angeles. I'll call it Park Biomechanics. No, I'll call it Disassembly and Repair. It sounds better. Tae Gon read the note. He smiled. He put the box under the table. Jia hadn't gone anywhere. She was sitting on the box in the corner of the workshop, just as she had been since day 1. She was munching on a tangerine. She was vaping. A tablet rested on her lap. On the screen was a map of Seoul covered with new markers. Blue, red, yellow, and new ones. Green. People. The zeros who had responded after the broadcast. 17 in 3 days. Another 23 had written in. Another 40 had called. Jia was writing down every single one, scheduling appointments, organizing meetings, just as she had done from day 1. Invisible to the system, indispensable to everyone. Tae Gon walked over to her. He asked if everything was okay. Jia looked up at him. She said everything was fine, you loser Oppa. Then she held out a container. Warm rice. She'd brought it that morning. Tae Gon took it. He sat down next to her. He ate. Jia was munching on a tangerine. They were silent. She didn't need words. She needed a place where she could be seen. The workshop was that place. Hasol slept in the corner on a fold-out bed. 8 hours every night. Normal sleep. No visions, no noise. The filter was working steadily. She'd wake up and smile first thing. Then she'd put on her headphones. But now music was playing through them. Not white noise. Music. She'd started keeping a tactical journal for the academy. She'd record probability lines for each student. Not all of them. Just one. The best one. The one where they succeeded. The students read and worked harder. Hasol said it wasn't magic, that she simply saw possibilities, but the possibilities she showed were always warm, always full of hope. She chose them on purpose. Ga-in drank the night after the tournament, but not like before, not until she threw up, not until her knuckles were broken. 1 bottle, on the roof, under the stars. Tae Gon went up to her at 3 in the morning, with rice, as always. He set the container on the railing. Ga-in sat there, looking out at the city. She said the arena reminded her of the last raid, that very one, where her partner had died. She said that when she was standing alone against 3 S ranks, she thought of him. That he would have stood with her, that he wouldn't have backed down, and that she stood behind Tae Gon just as her partner had once stood behind her. Not because Tae Gon ordered her to, because she chose to. Tae Gon sat next to her. He didn't speak. He just sat there. Ga-in drank. He waited. An hour later, she stood up. She looked down at him. She said that tomorrow she would start training the students, that biology wasn't enough. They needed to know how to stand their ground. Not to fight, to stand their ground. When everyone says you're a nobody, but you stand your ground and don't walk away. Tae Gon nodded. Ga-in left. She took the bottle with her. She didn't leave it on the roof like she used to. On the 4th day after the tournament, Tae Gon stepped out of the workshop in the morning. He stood on the street. He looked out over the neighborhood. Mafo, narrow streets, low-rise buildings, ordinary people without levels. His neighborhood, his place. He looked up. Above him was the sky, gray, Seoul style, and an empty space where his level used to be displayed. The system had removed the number, not because he had become stronger, not because he had surpassed some threshold, but because he had become something the system couldn't display. 5 evolutions in a single body: dragon, wolf, demon, crab, butterfly. 5 unfinished futures that he had preserved, plus 1 awakened present, Hasol, the first person he hadn't robbed but had healed. The system couldn't assign him a class because he was all classes and none at all, because his value couldn't be measured by a number, because he proved that a number isn't a person. The interface flashed. Tae Gon froze. For the first time ever, the system had sent him a non-standard message. Not a dry notification, a question. 2 words. Who are you? Tae Gon stood on a street in Mafo. The neighborhood was waking up around him. Shops were opening. People were heading to work. A young boy with a notebook was running toward the workshop for his morning class. An old man from the neighborhood was carrying a thermos of tea. A woman whose son had lost his sight was leading a boy by the hand toward a door with a sign. A one-armed hunter was walking with a carcass on his stump and smiling. 7 academy students turned the corner toward Yinju's workshop. Yoon So-hee was carrying a folder with a new report on synchronous evolution. They were heading toward him, everyone. Every day. Because he told them that their existence was not a mistake. Tae Gon looked at the system window. Who are you? He could have answered. He could have said that he was a carrier of the unfinished, that he was a biologist, that he was a janitor who had become a butcher, that he was a man with 5 alien evolutions in his body. He could have said many things, but he didn't. He closed the window, turned toward the workshop door, opened it, went inside. The carcass of a stone hedgehog lay on the table, the first order of the day. He picked up a pocket knife, that very one, with a blade forged from 4 evolutions, and began to cut, precisely, carefully, just like 10 years ago, just like yesterday, just like tomorrow. The door behind him opened. Someone walked in. Tae Gon didn't turn around. He knew it was the boy with the notebook. He knew the others would come after him. He knew it would be a long day. He knew that in Patagonia, the world boss was heading east. He knew that ahead lay the Second Arch, the War of the Guilds, and the unraveling of the Rift's mystery. But that was later. Right now, the stone hedgehog lay on the table, and it had an unrealized branch. Tae Gon saw it, a golden one, delicate, beautiful. The hedgehog could learn to vibrate its quills at a frequency that would soothe any living creature within a 10-meter radius. A small miracle. Unfinished. Tae Gon placed his hand on the shell. He spoke softly. I'm sorry, colleague. Let's see what you've left us. Outside the window, Seoul. Seoul was passing by. 40 million people with numbers above their heads, and one man without a number, with a knife, with a carcass on the table, with a team behind the wall, with a sign on the door. Carcass cutting and disposal. Inexpensive. He cut, precisely, quietly, as if nothing had changed, as if everything had changed. Above him, an empty space in the interface. Around him, people who were finally looking not at the number, but at his hands. At work. At the man. Silence. And in that silence, a single sound. The blade against the bone. Steady. Confident. The sound of a man who knows what he's doing, and does it every day. Not because he has to, because he knows how. Because he wants to. Because someone has to see what the monsters didn't have time to become. And he sees